Before I read the necessary emergency language, Ms. Bazemore, can you please call the roll?
Yes, Chair Krosner.
I'm here.
Mr. Stevens.
Here.
Ms. Teets.
Here.
Mr. Pontas. He's here. He just got back in the meeting. Ms. White.
Here.
Ms. Comot.
Here.
And then Mr. Hyra will be here a little bit later.
Right. He said he'd be about a half hour late. Okay, great. I'm glad to hear Ms. Teets' audio working this meeting, as opposed to, I forgot if it was the last meeting or the one before, but it seems like.
No, it was the last meeting.
Yeah, well, we hear you loud and clear tonight, so that's good. Okay. The meeting for which this agenda has been posted is going to be held pursuant to and in compliance with the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, Section 2.2-3708.2, and state and local legislation adopted to allow for continued government operation during the COVID-19 declared emergency. All participating members of the Planning Commission will be present at this meeting through electronic means. And all members of the public are welcome to view the meeting at our website, which is www.fallschurchva.gov/PC, and on Falls Church City Television, which you can view on CACT Channel 11, SCN Channel 2, and Verizon Wireless Channel 35. Public comments will be accepted virtually. Anyone who has signed up to speak will do so via the meeting platform. In order to speak on a public hearing item or provide general public comment, we would need to complete a speaker form on our website at www.fallschurchva.gov/public comment. And you must do that before noon on the day of a meeting. Following submission of that form, you will receive emailed instructions on how to join a virtual meeting. Written comments are also sent in advance and are accepted at the email address plan@fallschurchva.gov until noon on the day of the meeting. And anything that's received is sent to the Planning Commission and summarized here at the meeting. So with that, we will move on to adoption of tonight's agenda. Paul and I reviewed this agenda last week, and I think the way it's presented is logical. We have a couple work session items that will be the bulk of the discussion tonight, I anticipate. So our action items are relatively short, we think. So unless there's any discussion, I'd look for a motion to adopt the agenda as it was published.
I move that we adopt the October 20th, 2021 agenda for the Planning Commission as listed.
Great, thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
I think either it was Ms. Teets or someone jumped in there, so we'll say Ms. Teets seconds. And any discussion? If not, we'll get a roll call vote.
Chair Krosner.
Yes?
Mr. Stevens.
Yes.
Ms. Teets.
Yes.
Mr. Pontas.
Yes.
Ms. Weiss.
Yes.
Ms. Comot.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Then we can proceed. We have no speaker series tonight. We had a very interesting speaker series last meeting. Any petitions that have come in for things not on the agenda, Ms. Bazemore?
No.
Okay, just checking. So that brings us to our action items. And our first one, I guess Mr. Stoddard is going to summarize this.
Yeah, Zach Bradley, the Director of Public Works, and I coordinated on this one. He prepared the report. He wasn't available for tonight's meeting, so I'm happy to present the report, the staff report tonight. So this is before the commission for action tonight. The requested action is for the commission to make a recommendation on an honorary naming of the city's property yard, which is located in the Gordon Road Triangle, and to name it to honor Robert Goff's service to the city. You can see in the staff report it details the process and the procedure related to the naming of city facilities and who reviews it. The reason for, I'm going to jump down to the timing section before I get into some of the accolades. Timing's on line 77. The reason this is before you for your recommendation tonight is because it is scheduled for a public hearing for council to take final action on November 8th. So if we jump down to the draft resolution, which begins on line 88, you can actually see some of the great things that Robert Goff did while he was working with the city. There on line 96 starts it off that he began working with the city in 1981 and he retired just this year in 2021. So a full 40 years of service to the community in his time with Public Works and really working at all levels of the organization, eventually becoming the superintendent of maintenance operations. And I think one of the things that folks around the city would probably know is that Robert was always available to help, regardless of the weather conditions. If you look there on line 104, it talks about some of the natural disasters that Robert worked through. And he was a guy that had a reputation for showing up and helping people out regardless of the hour of the day, regardless of the weather outside. He was always there when the city was flooding, when it was covered in snow, when the wind had blown down the trees. Robert was there getting the crews organized, making sure that people were safe in their homes and providing services where he could. And it wasn't just the big stuff, it was the little stuff. I know his attitude was always, well, let's just give people what they want. If people want a block party, let's figure out a way to do a block party. If people want to do tree lights, let's figure out how to do tree lights. I don't know if I ever heard a no from him. He was just someone that was easy to work with, always helped people out, and always put in the time and effort. So I'm obviously happy to make a positive recommendation from staff on the Planning Commission moving forward with this item. But I'm happy to take any questions or provide any answers.
Thank you, Mr. Stoddard. And I would just align myself with your comments, Mr. Goff. I didn't work with him all that often, but you know, I'd heard many stories about his long tenure at the city, and certainly sets a high standard for all city employees. We'll see if some of our planners can make it 40 years, Paul. I don't know, but it's quite impressive, and he certainly was. I didn't realize he had such a family connection to the city, which you mentioned. So sounds like a very worthy honor for Mr. Goff. So that's all I have to say about it. If anyone else has anything they'd like to add.
No, I just wanted to add, I know it had been traditional in the city to wait till people passed to naming things after him, and we've been kind of working around it. We got Howard Herman Park named after, I think Howard had 38 years or something more than, like, it was an incredibly long tenure as well. And but I think it's really great when we name it after the people while we are here, and we all remember how much they've done for us. And the best thing about Robert Goff is no matter what you ask for him, he did get it done, but he did it with a smile on his face. He didn't have to smile. He didn't have to be gracious. I don't know how many times we would ask for things for habitat restoration or, you know, some other like community service thing we were doing, and he was happy to help. Just a really nice guy. And every October, my Girl Scout troop, we used to make treats. October, November, they would make food for the Public Works guys to try to like curry favor before snow started to arrive, and they were always just, you know, he was just very nice about it and very thankful. So just a very good person.
Absolutely. And he certainly, I think, was the guiding force behind, you know, the excellent snow plowing, you know, the city receives. It's been a while since we've had a big storm, but, you know, we'll see how, you know, when we eventually get another one, if we can, you know, maintain the pretty, I consider really great snow plowing the city has compared to, you know, what sometimes people outside the city have to contend with VDOT snowplows.
Oh yeah, if we had a bad snow, like a 10-inch or 15-inch, you could walk down Hillwood and see where about half a block in off of Hillwood, those side streets became Fairfax County, and all the Fairfax County people would be parked on Hillwood trying to get to their houses.
Right, and Goff was definitely, you know, he was running that whole show, you know, and I was definitely aware of that. So, yeah, that's excellent. Okay, well, if anyone has anything else to add, Mr. Stevens' hand is up. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I can go ahead and get this started. Move that the Planning Commission recommend to City Council the adoption of TR 21-30 to name the property guard the Robert L. Goff Operations Center.
Thank you. Do we have a second on that?
Second.
Second by Ms. Teets.
I was waiting for Mr. Stevens to read all the whereases, but I guess he's not going to.
Oh, why don't we read the whereases? I think 40 years maybe is justified to read the whereases. Why not?
Okay. Whereas Robert Goff dedicated his career and service to the City of Falls Church for over 40 years and showed exemplary leadership as the Superintendent of Operations for the Department of Public Works. And whereas Mr. Goff started work for the city in May 1981 in the water utility as a maintenance worker, rose to be appointed Superintendent of Operations in October 2000, and retired from the city on July 1st, 2021. And whereas Mr. Goff was recognized as the city's Employee of the Year in 1997 for his outstanding work and responsiveness in the operation of the water utility. And whereas Mr. Goff was always on duty to restore order after natural disasters, managing critical Department of Public Works operations for Hurricane Isabel in 2003, Snowmageddon in 2010, the Derecho 2012, and Tropical Storm Lee 2014, along with countless other events, and was always the calm within the storm in any emergency. And whereas Mr. Goff supported the residents of Falls Church with special events every year, such as the Memorial Day Festival, Martin Luther King Day, Watch Night, Independence Day celebrations, holiday tree lighting, hundreds of neighborhood block parties, and countless other special events that required public works support. And whereas Mr. Goff ensured that Department of Public Works operations was ready and able to support all city departments, and day in and day out, Mr. Goff set a standard for leadership and honesty that the hardworking men and women of his team in Department of Public Works operations relied upon, and that all city employees continue to aspire to. And residents of the city knew that they could rely on Mr. Goff for assistance during windstorms, floods, and blizzards, and that they would always be greeted with a can-do attitude for solving problems. And whereas naming the property yard as the Robert L. Goff Operations Yard provides a positive recognition of not just Robert Goff's dedication to the city, but also of the dedication of all the men and women of Department of Public Works operations who have dedicated their labor to the benefit of the city. And whereas the naming meets the criteria of City Code Section 2-210 for naming a facility to commemorate an individual's service, facilities may be named after an individual who has made significant contributions to the City of Falls Church through participation in community, state, or national service. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the City Council of the City of Falls Church, Virginia, that the city property located at 7100 Gordon Road, known as the Property Yard, be formally named the Robert L. Goff Operations Yard to honor this longtime city employee and operations superintendent, and the hardworking and dedicated members of the Department of Public Works Operations Division.
Okay, I assume the seconder seconds the rest of the whereases too.
I'll second it again.
That was good. Actually, yeah, I think that's an excellent motion. Whoever drafted that on city staff, that's an excellent summary of his service, and hopefully he'll get a nice copy of that once council adopts it. Okay, well, unless there are any further discussion on that, we have a motion and a second, and we need a roll call vote.
Chair Krasner? Chair Krasner?
Yes, did you hear me? Sorry.
Mr. Stevens?
Yes.
Ms. Teets?
Yes.
Mr. Puentes?
Yes.
Ms. Weiss?
Yes.
Ms. Comont?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Our next item is the very exciting October 6th minutes, which was a long meeting. So again, kudos to staff for getting these minutes turned around so quickly to have them ready to go at the next meeting. That's actually a standard that sounds easy, but as someone who works with lots of boards and commissions, I'll tell you, it is not easy, and that's amazing that you can get it done like that so quickly. So, does anyone have any corrections, edits, comments on the October 6th minutes? Mr. Stevens, your hand is up.
Yeah, my apology. I have two small word changes I'd like to see made. On line 61, I'd rather have it read, encouraged flexibility in setting the percent of commercial component. So take out adjusting and replace it with flexibility in setting. And then in line 64, clarification on the future EV charging station percentage. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Comat?
I think there's a reference to approval of the October 6th minutes in these October 6th minutes. If you scroll down, I think it was further down at the bottom. I think it actually should be the September 1st minutes, action items, right?
Yeah, that's
We
great.
approved, yeah. So I think it was September 1st was our last meeting. It was, I think we were off mid-September. So that's the only thing I saw. Thank you.
If I could just jump in for a meeting, I don't know if it's just my screen. Emily, are you able to zoom in to make it a little easier to read? Perfect, thank you. The bigger one was better if that works for you. Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Weiss, your hand is up.
Yeah, two comments to the minutes, which I guess could go below line 77. Just wanted to add two more bullets to the Founders Row 2 section. I would just add that a commissioner requested that the applicant include, increase tree canopy. And there was a member from the CACT who spoke quite extensively, and I don't see his comments referenced at all. So maybe a member of the CACT encouraged a more extensive look at pedestrian and bike accessibility and safety.
Actually, now that I'm looking at this page, I mean, the only other thing I might add too is if you can identify which commissioner instead of a commissioner, probably better, again, and this is just because, again, of the nature of this case, that it's probably good to just track, which commissioner said what. So even though I know we have the video and people can review the video, it's, I think it's better to be specific.
If we're going to do that, we might want to change that for all minutes, because I think typically our minutes have said a commissioner rather than a specific person. That's probably above my pay grade, but I just wanted to note that would be different from other minutes.
Maybe Mr. Stoddard and I can talk about, I don't want to upset the whole apple cart with the format, but.
Well, I was going to say, typically minutes like this don't call out people except for specific votes. And that's the standard. I work in the trade associated nonprofit world, and that's the standard, is that you just use names when there's voting.
Okay, yeah, like I said, I don't want to upset the apple cart. I guess I've seen it different ways, but if that's how it's been done forever, and I'm not remembering that, then that's fine. Okay. All right, if there are no further comments, corrections, or edits on the minutes, I will ask for a motion to adopt them as amended tonight, or with the revisions that cited tonight.
I move that we adopt the minutes of October 6th as amended.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Yeah, I can second. This is Tim.
Okay, second by Mr. Stevens. Any discussion on the motion? If not, we'll get a roll call vote.
Mr. Krasner?
Yes.
Mr. Stevens?
Yes.
Ms. Teets?
Yes.
Mr. Puentes?
Yes.
Ms. Weiss?
Yes.
Ms. Comat?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
So adopted. All right, so moving right along here. We're ahead of Paul's schedule, which is always good. Brings us to number 7, information items. And 7A is any planning commissioners reports.
So I attended the CACT meeting last week, and obviously they talked a lot about Founders Road 2 and about some additional concerns and things that they had. So I think we're going to be seeing a letter from them pretty soon. And I think they're specifically not just pedestrian bike, they're also concerned about cars coming in and out of West Street and what that flow is going to look like. And they did get a presentation from the developer that was specifically traffic, transportation oriented. And then he answered a lot of their questions about flow and about what that intersection looks like now and things like that. And I think based on all that, we'll get a more detailed letter from them with more of their thoughts about the transportation side of Founders Road 2. They also talked about that the traffic common projects on Great Falls and Little Falls have been completed. When they started, it was like one big giant project, and over this took, I think it started in 2015. I was looking for my notes on it. So they got a traffic common request for Little Falls and Great Falls in 2015, and so through the years, lots of things happened. Neighbors moved, neighbors came in. They had to keep going back and getting quorums again. And so one of the things that they learned from it is that project beginning was too big, and they eventually split it in half, and that's how they were able to get it done. So they just talked a lot about the learning that they got out of that project. And I don't know if you've been on there, you can see the several, there's multiple things that have been done on both streets to try to calm the traffic down a little bit.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Teets. Anybody else? Mr. Stevens, is that your hand up from before? Or?
No, I attended the Architectural Advisory Board meeting on October the 13th, and they addressed the Founders Row 2 project. But I think rather than go through, they had about a half a dozen observations. I think rather than doing that here, they're going to send out minutes that we will probably no doubt have, but when we take up Founders Row 2 again, and it might be better to have their formal comments rather than kind of my summary comments verbally. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Ms. Coma, your hand is up.
Yeah, the Housing Commission and the Housing and Human Services Department organized a community forum for residents of the Fields. I think you might remember that they sent a letter about some concerns that they had with the apartment buildings there. So it was actually a really great session. It was very well organized. Dana Lewis invited Matthew Whitfield, who's an attorney from Legal Services of Northern Virginia. He advised the tenants on their rights and what recourse they had. There are different options for, encouraging the management to address these issues they had. The issues are largely rodents and mold, which are pretty serious issues. I think you might remember that those were in the letter. But there are other issues raised about concern about some unfair pricing for 2-bedroom units that are the same price but very different in size. So I think Kettler is starting to work through some of these issues. They've replaced, there were also representatives from Kettler there, and then the senior vice president with Kettler attended the Housing Commission meeting immediately after this community forum. It was last Tuesday at Burnham Park, right by the Fields. So we heard from them, and so they have new management at that particular facility, and they have a new contract with Orkin Pest Control, and they met with Fairfax County Health Department, their Division of Environmental Health. So they're starting to work through some of these issues, and I think we can expect an update in about 30 days. So I would say it was a really good meeting, and I think the residents felt encouraged that there was, a lot of attention from the city, and that this had been organized on their behalf. And so, hopefully these issues will be addressed.
Okay, thank you. That sounds like a good development in a not so great situation. So hopefully they can make some progress there. Okay, Mr. Stevens, did you have another thing to add?
I'm sorry, I didn't lower my hand from the last time.
That's okay. Okay. Any other planning commissioner reports? If not, that'll take us to the director's report, Mr. Stoddard.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the Commission. No written report for the Planning Director's report at this meeting. Just a couple meeting and agenda items to update you all on. I did attend the Founders Row 2 walking tour that was hosted on the property site this afternoon. I think it ran from about 3 in the afternoon to 4:30. For folks that weren't able to attend, there will be a virtual town hall held in the evening tomorrow. I know that flyer went out to the Commission, and I think it's also up on the city website, so people can find the meeting link there. And then just looking ahead at the agenda, Ms. Bazemore, do we have the agenda? Thank you. So a couple things that are on the PC's agenda, as well as related items going out either for community meetings or council schedule. Are we able to, I'm sorry, I got my screen. I think I have a smaller screen than everyone else. Thank you. So just looking ahead, bouncing across the columns, next Monday, the One City Center project application is scheduled for consideration for first reading and referral out to boards and commissions. The November 3rd meeting of the Planning Commission, which would be your next regular meeting, you all will have a work session on street names related to the West Falls project. Your second work session on the Founders 2 project proposal, and then assuming a positive referral on One City Center next Monday, you all would have your first work session on One City Center. Then Saturday, November 6th, there would be a community kickoff meeting for the East End Small Area Plan. This is the last of the city's planning opportunity areas to get the small area planning attention. We held a stakeholders meeting with property owners and agency staff from surrounding jurisdictions recently, and now this would be the open to the public community meeting. It would follow the traditional format we've gone in, which is an in-person meeting with breakout groups. In order to operate the meeting safely, we've coordinated with Columbia Baptist to run it in Stevenson Hall, which folks may remember is the largest meeting room in the Columbia Baptist Church. And based on participation we've got at last meetings, we think we could safely distance everyone. We've also talked to our emergency coordinator here on city staff about running events like this. Meeting flyer for that, we're hoping to get out later this week, since that will give us about 2 weeks notice with the flyer in advance of the meeting. Getting back to the Planning Commission's agenda, November 17th, your second regular meeting in November. We'll talk about this tonight with the next item, but tentatively scheduled for you all to take final action on the Broad Washington site plan, final action on the West Falls Church street names, and final action for your recommendation on the Founders Row 2 project proposal. And that would be the first item would be final action on that project, Broad Washington. The other two would be your recommendations back to council. And then closing out December with review on the One City Center project, a planning commission work session on East End Small Area Plan, and then reserving that second meeting in December for your annual advance. And that was in response to the commission's request to get the advance scheduled at the end of the calendar year instead of waiting for February or March of the following year. That's the end of my report. I'm happy to take any questions on agenda items or anything that's missing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stoddard. I think I told you last week you have us pretty busy the rest of the year, so it's some years we're not quite as busy as we head towards December, but this fall is different. Okay, unless there are any questions from the commissioners for Mr. Stoddard, that will take us to item 8, our work sessions for the evening, which are the main event. Our first work session is on the second submission for the Broad Washington site plan. We've seen this in an earlier iteration of the site plan earlier this year, and the resubmission is back. I think we will start with a staff report.
Yeah, let me introduce this just briefly before I turn it over to the case planner, Ms. Keita Ruzzi. Chair Krasner, you're correct. This is before you all as a work session to review the site plan application for the Broad and Washington project, which of course is located at the intersection, the northeast intersection of Broad and Washington streets. The staff recommendation, just let me walk you through, just hit the highlights here. Staff finds that the application is generally consistent with the approved CDP, and it largely responds to the comments that were made by staff and planning commission to the first submission. And so what staff has identified is a couple items that ought to be resolved prior to the planning commission taking an action tentatively on November 17th on the application. With that being a conditional action to clean up any remaining items with a staff or an administrative review. That's similar to how we've run other large site plans where the bulk of the items are resolved, the major public items are resolved prior to planning commission action, and the remaining technical items with direction from the planning commission are resolved by staff following that public event. So that's going to be the request and the recommendation, but I'll actually pause there and go ahead and turn it over to our case planner, Ms. Keita Ruzzi, for the full staff report.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening. This is Akita with planning. The item before you this evening is the second submission of the Broad and Washington site plan application. Just as a refresher, a little bit of background on the project. The City Council approved a special exception application and related conceptual development plan back in January. A site plan submission and approval by the Planning Commission is the required next step in the process prior to building permitting and eventually to construction. Also part of the process at site plan is a subdivision plat that's required for consolidation of the 4 separate parcels included in the development. The overall application also includes waivers to reduce the total required parking, reduction in buffer landscape density, and reduction in the required minimum distance between a commercial driveway and an R district. These waivers are fairly common with mixed use or commercial development in the city and is subject to approval by the Planning Commission as part of the site plan. Additionally, the applicant has identified several spaces in the garage that do not meet column spacing requirements and standard parking dimensions. They intend to file for a variance subject to approval by the BZA following a recommendation from the Planning Commission. In terms of application status, the Planning Commission held a work session on July 21st and provided feedback on the first submission. Questions and comments from the Planning Commission are summarized on page 5 of the report and included items such as parking dimensions, missing documents, garage layout and accessibility, location of plan elements like bike storage and electrical vehicle stations, composting, and streetscape maintenance. A second submission was received on September 14th and addressed some of these items. Staff reviewed the new submission and issued comments to the applicant on October 12th. In terms of updates since the first submission, the second submission revisions include additional documents and details provided, including TDM, parking management plan, fleet score sheet, EV and bike storage locations, ADUs, work from home units, among other updates. Changes to stormwater management and design, changes to architectural materials and massing to include Lawton Street facade materials changed from fiber cement to masonry to match the 2018 approved CDP plan pursuant to the voluntary concession. Residential bay depth reduced to accommodate to final interior programming. And then third architectural change would be further massing reductions along the rear elevation. I believe the applicant will cover some of these changes in their presentation later in more detail, so I'll just sort of hit the highlights of these. And then number 4, the proposed fire truck turnaround at the east end of Park Place was removed. Then finally updates the parking garage layout, including location of and access to the public spaces. In terms of staff reviews, site plans are reviewed primarily for consistency with the approved conceptual development plan, comprehensive plan, site plan, ordinance, and other applicable zoning code and regulations. Staff review in these areas are provided in the staff report, so I'll just summarize that section. In terms of conceptual development consistency, the proposed site plan is generally consistent with the approved special exception with some adjustments to building setback on Park Place, interior parking layout, addition of the second entrance on Park Place, and relocation of the transformers from the linear park to the west side of the building. The building setback on Park Place increased to satisfy the original lot and manor subdivision building restriction line, and this also resulted in changes to the interior parking garage layout. There are no other major changes in terms of use, building footprint, project size, and building height. The special exception parking ratios are generally the same, and the project still entails a mixed-use building with ground floor retail and an anchor grocer. The public open spaces are also the same. In terms of comprehensive plan and small area conformance, the development project is consistent with both plans as evaluated and concluded during the special exception process and approval. In terms of site plan code consistency, required considerations for approval include consistency with the comp plan, which I just mentioned, recommendations of staff and advisory boards, and plans impacts on general safety and public welfare. The current site plan demonstrates consistency with many of these considerations included in the site plan ordinance. During review, as Mr. Stoddard just mentioned, staff has identified several items to address as the project moves forward. These items start at line 187 of the report. The two immediate items are the adjacent business input on the garage layout, and then Lawton Street neighborhood and community engagement. In discussions with the applicant last week, these are in progress, and I believe they have some updates to share with the Planning Commission this evening on that. The remaining items starting at line 199 can be addressed after Planning Commission action in an administrative process, and I'll elaborate on that when I go over the schedule in a bit. So the remaining staff items include comprehensive signage plan, generator, exhaust fans, and garage vents. Staff is looking for more information from the applicant on visual and air quality impacts. I believe they're going to discuss that this evening as well. EV charging stations, we have gotten clarification from the applicant on this since the report was written, so this item is addressed. They have a total of 14 charging stations and 15 conduits for future stations, which actually exceed the VC agreement. Variance application and BZA approval, that's another pending item moving forward. And the North Washington Park Place signal, they're working out the final design and layout details with city engineers, so that's what's reflected in the staff comments and the attachments. So that coordination is still ongoing. Architecture staff has provided some recommendations on this for them to consider. And then finally, parking enforcement mechanism to be finalized prior to issuance of first certificate of occupancy and jointly agreed by city and applicant. Here, just staff would just like to have some input in what enforcement will ultimately look like, and that's what we're trying to capture here. So finally, I'll just wrap up with in terms of schedule and next steps. Staff recommends final consideration by Planning Commission on November 17th. The expectation would be for the applicant to continue working on their site plan to address the latest staff comments and work with the community on their concerns, and then submit a third submission for staff review and administrative approval by the planning director. The plan would be to wrap up with site plan before the new year. And that's really the tentative schedule. That's all I have for the staff report. I'm happy to take any questions. Otherwise, the applicant is here and would like to make a presentation to the Planning Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ruzzi. Let's see, other questions for staff? Looks like Ms. Weiss has a hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question for staff is, you know, I saw that there was an attached letter from the Urban Forestry Commission, which I read with great interest and then realized it was dated November of last year. So I'm just wondering, is there supposed to be a more recent letter from the Urban Forestry Commission?
Yeah, you are correct, Ms. Weiss. Actually, there isn't. And when I asked the city arborist, they said they felt like the SC recommendations did not get addressed in the site plan. And so they sort of just emphasize that recommendation. So they do not have a new recommendation.
Can I just clarify what you're saying? So they don't have a new recommendation, but they feel like their last letter was not addressed and they are effectively resubmitting it for consideration tonight?
That's correct.
Okay.
And just to clarify, those, Akita, oh, might have broken a chair. Just to clarify, those comments were sent when this was under consideration for the special exception. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So these would have been comments when, this would have been the comment set that was sent from the Urban Forestry Commission to the council when the council was considering the conceptual development plan, which of course the council always weighs all the comments from the boards and commissions. But then in terms of what the applicant is bound to, once the CDP is adopted by the council, that becomes a condition of their approval, and they are then obligated to proceed with something that matches the CDP. And so that becomes the standard against which staff evaluates the site plan.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stoddard. Actually, just a quick, I don't see anyone else's hands. I have a quick question for staff, and maybe the applicant will, I'm sure the applicant will address this too, but you mentioned a need for a variance for the column width. You mentioned spaces, plural. I guess the question I have is how many spaces and columns are involved in this, and what's the background on that? Because maybe that was mentioned earlier this year, but I don't recall that.
Yeah, so we did not, this was a question in the first submission comments to the applicant. At that time, these substandard spaces were not identified, and they've identified it in the second submission, and then we've sort of outlined a process for BZA approval or consideration. So I don't have the total numbers, but it is several spaces in the garage, both substandard for column spacing and then parking dimensions. Some of these are called just compact spaces. They don't meet the standard parking dimensions.
For me, there's a big difference depending, maybe the applicant can address this, but how many we're talking about. If it's, a small number, well, perhaps, and I know ultimately if it's a variance request, it goes to the BZA with our recommendation, but if it's not a small number, that to me is problematic. We've all seen garages in town where they don't meet column spacing and dimensions, and what that leads to, everything from damaged cars to people not wanting to park in those garages, and the spaces, basically people deciding it's not worth it to park in there, I'll find a spot out on the street. And I know in this particular project that's a major concern from neighbors and others. So I'll be very interested to hear why, a new building being designed, this is a new part of our ordinance too, correct, Ms. Ruzzi? The requirements in there were just revised, but within the last 5 years, correct? For parking dimensions?
Correct. That is correct, Mr. Pressler.
This isn't some old, outdated part of our code that's kicking around and, oh, geez, I wish we didn't have that. This is a brand new part of the code that was adopted specifically to avoid that problem. So in order to prove a hardship under Virginia law and city code, or the fact that you're being denied adequate use of the property to meet the variance standard at the Board of Zoning Appeals, I'd be very interested to hear how the developer plans to craft such an argument in order to be successful with a variance application. But I guess we can let the developer answer that. Other questions for staff? Mr. Stevens' hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I did have a couple of questions for Akita, recognizing that some of this may get addressed by Mr. Stern, but I'll go ahead with these here. There was discussion in several places regarding these grates and vents in the linear park, and so I'll be kind of in interest of getting some additional information on those. First of all, whether they're active. In other words, are there mechanical fans in these vents and grates? Is this the only place that they can occur? So there was also a letter from one of the residents on Lawton Street regarding this. So I guess it's something we should be more educated about. I'm hesitant to reach any conclusions at this point without additional information. Also, there was a comment in the staff report, line 217 and 18, about, this is on architecture, that staff would be looking at techniques to visually separate the floors. And I'm just wondering, is that something staff is actively looking at and waiting for the developer to come back with some additional modifications to reflect that? So I'll be looking for some more information on that. And then the final question I had to do with the parking, whether or not staff ever looked at the possibility of putting all of the 64 spaces on one level as opposed to splitting them. I know that what's in the presentation for this evening is a considerable improvement over what we saw, a month or so ago. But I'm just curious as to whether or not that possibility had ever been considered. And those are the questions I had on the staff side.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Let's see, Ms. Rizzi, do you have?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Stevens. I think for the vents and the grates, I might have to just kind of defer to the applicant on that one because as staff, we also have similar questions. So we're just trying to understand the visual and air quality impacts from those in terms of how they operate and how they look. So I think we'll hear more from the applicant this evening on that. And then on the second question on architecture, I think Mr. Starter, I might let you speak to that, the visually separating floors, the principle of base, middle, and top that we've been discussing.
Sure, happy to talk about that. So just quickly, and we have, Commissioner, to your question, we have shared some ideas with the applicant on this. The idea at this point in the project is not to suggest anything that's going to change the internal programming or really substantially change the materials on the outside of the building. Some of it is just adding a few architectural touches that you see that are commonly used in buildings throughout the region. So we've picked some examples where we, look at the proposed facade for Broadview, Washington. We compare that to what we see in buildings around the region, and we suggest some minor tweaks. For example, the organizing of floors. The face of the building along North Washington was changed, I think, positively in response to the joint AAB and Planning Commission work session to help organize that a little better. The result is still a little bit flat, and so we suggested just a little bit of turn in some of the bricks. Every other floor would create sort of a horizontal separation between the floors, so that instead of one large building face, you might see, the base of the building with the Whole Foods. You'd sort of visually see, 2 stacks of residential, another 2 stacks of residential, and then the top of the building. It would help break it down for anybody looking at it, of course, from the outside. And similar modest suggestions to other faces of the building, whether it's the proportion of the buildings, the treatment of materials, maybe simplifying the material selection in some cases where there may be too many or too few. So those are the form of the comments.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I was just mainly curious as to whether or not you're actively working the issue. The reason I've raised it in part is because I remember back when Russ Wadiska was still our chair, and he made this observation on the prior project. That goes back to about 2017, 2018. So, but if you're continuing to work the issue, that's fine.
We had discussed more specifically putting all of the public parking spaces on the top level, which is now labeled P3, and the previous submission was P4. Whether it was possible to put all of the public spaces, needed public space on that level, because that level then is accessed by Park Place, and that would then have the best connectivity to adjacent businesses. But I believe that was not feasible. So I think maybe I'll let the applicant speak just to and I do agree, staff looked at the current submission, and we believe this is an improvement compared with the last submission. But I think putting them all on the same level just wasn't feasible given the reduction on the city lot portion of the building.
Are you comfortable with the outcome at that point?
I don't know if it's just my connection. I couldn't hear the question.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Oh, sorry. Just wondering, are you okay with that outcome? In other words, having it split the way it is?
I mean, we've looked at this different ways, and this is really the best they can do, given the constraints of the site.
Okay, I think that's all I had, Mr. Chair, for right now. I've got additional questions for the developer, but I'll hold off on those for now.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Stevens. All right, if there's no other questions at this time for staff, we can always obviously come back to staff. I guess we will throw it over to the developer. I think Mr. Stern is on the call here to provide the presentation.
Yes, I am here. Thank you all. Maury Stern with Inside Property Group. Good to see you all again. I'm joined tonight by Ed Newman from Inside Property Group, who will do some of the presenting in a minute, and then Neville Fernandez, whom you all know, who's our architect with MB&A, Kevin Sitzman with Grove Slate, our traffic engineer, and then Joe Riley Reagan, who is our civil engineer, and Steve Sattler, who is our landscape architect. So we have all the disciplines covered if there are questions about specific topics. But we're going to start out by, I think, addressing a few of the comments from the commissioners that just came up. We thought we'd start with the staff comments from the previous submission and the meeting in July, address some of the major comments from the staff's second round of comments, many of which we think we've actually already addressed or are in the process of addressing, like to discuss how we're addressing them. Talk through the architecture a little bit, talk through the progress on the intersection at Park Place and North Washington, and then happy to take any and all the questions that you all have. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ed, who will dig into some of the details of the previous comments and the current round of comments. And if you don't mind, flip to the next, actually 2 slides forward, please.
Good evening, everybody. Like Maury said, I'm Ed Newman. I'm with Inside Property Group. Working on this development at Broadview, Washington. So like Maury said, just wanted to hit some of the highlights from the first session. These next 2 slides are going to kind of closely mirror what Akita just went through on the staff report. So some of them might be redundant, but so the first item that we just talked about for the modifications that mentioned of spacing and columns. Like Akita said, we are going to submit a zoning variance application. We can go through this in a little bit more detail. I believe some of this is laid out in one of the slides later in terms of location and number of these, and then Neville can go into a little bit more about why we need to have the compact spaces or column widths at the locations we requested them. The next item we addressed were the missing documents. With the second submission, I believe staff has acknowledged that the missing documents are provided and majority of items addressed. The parking garage layout was an item we went through last time, and we just talked about it a few minutes ago. As Akita said, we made some adjustments, biggest of which is consolidating all the public deeded spaces together into a contiguous form, even though it does split from 2 levels. Like Akita said, we put a lot of thought into this, and the updated exhibits are part of the site plan submission that we most recently put in. Location of bike storage and electrical vehicle stations. These have been identified in the second plan submission. As Akita said, the electrical vehicle and future electric vehicle stations are identified. The work from home units, there has been an exhibit provided to give a little bit more information in the second site submission that goes a little bit more into detail with these. Utility poles along Park Place, as shown, are shown on the plans as being undergrounded. This was included in the second submission to address. An ADU tabulation was included in our second site plan submission to address the item from last meeting. And the streetscape maintenance, I believe this came up in the AAB meeting, but we plan to take care of all this streetscape maintenance along our property line. That's something we plan to do, and it's pretty typical for our developments. So for the second submission, these are the items that, in the staff report that Akita just went through. As we discussed, the garage layout and adjacent business input, we've met personally with the adjacent retailers, Clarendon's and Thompson's Italian. We went through and showed them the revised parking plans and what we have. As far as I'm concerned, they didn't have major concerns with what we showed them. Most of our discussion was really just about coordination with construction and logistics. And as far as Lawton Street neighborhood input, we met with the Lawton Street neighbors as recently as this Monday to go through a few of their concerns. The meeting went well. We were planning to meet with them regularly going forward to address and provide heads up for any work that's going to be going on, and it's going to be a regular thing going forward, and we can coordinate with them for frequency and time. So, as Akita mentioned, there's a list of items that can be addressed subsequent to Planning Commission action, and I just wanted to give an update on what we've got here. So, comprehensive signage plan. This is going to be finalized and will be included with our third submission. We've talked with Akita. I think we have a good idea of what exactly we're required to have and what we're looking for in terms of location, specificity, and the appearance of the signs. The generator, exhaust fans, and garage vents. I can go into a little bit more detail about this item. So, in the site plan, the landscaping and over the plan view shows these grates along the park pathway leading from Lawton to Park Place. These grates aren't actually at grade. They are elevated above ground about 7 or 8 feet and contained within a shaft wall that's going to have the same facade that we have on the back of the building. It's going to be clad in the stone with a nice stone cap on top. As far as the impacts to the park, they are fan fed for the below grade garages. During normal operations, there will be 1 fan running per level at low speed. They're all controlled by variable frequency drivers, so the only way they would kick into high gear is if there was some sort of air quality diminished within the parking garage. That would trigger the fans to turn on to recirculate and disperse the air. As far as the exhaust in the park area, by code, this exhaust is considered environmental exhaust in the same kind of category as kitchen exhaust or a dryer. So as far as air quality impacts, it would be minimal at best. And as far as sound goes, like I said, it'd be 1 fan running at low speed most of the time. EV charging stations, like Akita said, we've addressed this. They're included on the parking layout exhibit. There's 14 EV stations and 15 future EV stations. The variance application will be submitted shortly, as we mentioned earlier. The North Washington and Park Place signal, we met with some city engineers last week and Kevin with Groves Slade to go over the second submission and address any questions. I believe the outcome of that meeting was that the overall concept of the intersection is set. The poles and locations and lengths should be good. I think the next thing is just to work out our queuing and timing calculations. Architectural items, I can let Neville go into that a little bit more, but looks like we have an AAB meeting on November 3rd. And then, as Akita mentioned, parking enforcement will be finalized prior to obtaining the first certificate of occupancy. We'll all have input on how exactly that's going to work. And then the DRC comments will also be addressed post-PC action. And with that, I think the next slide is for Kevin for the intersection and the updates here.
Thank you, Ed. Kevin Sitzman with Grove Slade. We're designing the Park Place addition to the North Washington Park Avenue signal. As Ed mentioned, we've met with Mr. Bradley and his staff last week. It was a very productive meeting. We worked through several issues that set some design direction for us. There had been a little bit of discussion on how best to avoid impacts to the State Theater, how to make sure that this somewhat unusual signal is not any more unusual for drivers than it needs to be, and some specifics regarding the placement of the signal pole locations and the types of poles. We worked through all of those things with staff. It was a very helpful meeting, and got all of that set so that we are now in the process of the last 2 cleanup items, which is to specify all of the locations of the signal heads and the wiring and control of the signal on the signal plan itself, and then to submit to staff the traffic evaluation using Synchro for the slightly revised operation that we came up with at the meeting, so that they can make sure all of that is going to work. We had, as recently as today, we had provided staff with just an update on particulars of the traffic signal control cabinet and whether it was able to accommodate a couple of technical things that we discussed at the meeting. It is, and so we think we're well on the way to that, to get that all resolved and get the poles ordered and get the signal constructed and under operation.
Thank you, Kevin.
So I think with that, turn over to Neville Fernandez from MVNA to talk about the building architecture.
Thank you, Maury. On the whole, just like staff said, there aren't a whole lot of changes. We've been making some minor modifications based on all the details that we are slowly figuring out. So I'll walk you through some of these views. All these views are part of the second submission, and I'll point out where changes, if any, have happened, where they're happening. This is the view from the corner of Brown and Washington. There is nothing that's changed for the building architecture from this point of view. It is very, very similar to what we had during the CDP process. And we're happy to see that it is still playing out that way. The next slide will show a small change. The change is not happening along Washington Street. It's happening further away from Washington Street. It's the bank of balcony spaces and the units between the balcony spaces. They used to be deeper. The problem is these units are facing north, northeast. They're not going to get a whole lot of direct sunlight. The units are becoming very deep. So we decided to shave off a few inches and push those units in a little bit. It's still articulated. The balcony zones are still creating this nice cadence across the facade. The overall effect is very, very similar. Again, just making minor adjustments based on the actual unit layouts and the unit depths. That's the only change that's happened along this face. Next slide, please. This is again the entrance at Park Place. At Park Place. Not a whole lot has changed here, especially at the residential level. We've been making minor adjustments at the parking level. This is very, very similar to what we showed you the last time around with the two separated entrances. You're seeing the Whole Foods entrance in the foreground and the public parking entrance for the back there. We're continuing to work with details and landscape. And I think this view does show what is currently on the drawings. So you'll get a good sense of what this looks like right now. Next, please. This is, we are now at the corner of Lawton Street and Broad Street. Again, architecturally, from a massing point of view, there really is no change. What's changed is that we now have the brick from Broad Street turn the corner and go to Lawton Street. So the massing, the three-story massing on top of Creative Cauldron used to be fiber cement panels. All of that has gone to the same brick architecture that you saw, that you're seeing on Broad Street. So I think that's a good positive move. I believe staff mentioned that this actually does reflect the same amount of masonry as shown in the 2018 application. Actually, for our calculations, it actually exceeds it. But anyways, that's just great. It made sense to kind of go ahead and complete that entire mass with brick and not just leave hardy on the top, just to kind of make the numbers work. Next slide, please. So this is again continuing up Lawton Street. You're seeing that brick mass on the left that's turning the corner and kind of ending, and then you're seeing the massing drop, and that's the one place where the hardy panels have been retained. But you're still seeing the same brick bays and the same stone bays. You're also seeing the new landscaping that's been proposed. And while we don't really have the existing trees accurately shown, but that's just an idea of where their locations are. And you can see that, you know, it really does cover a whole lot and feels pretty lush along Lawton Street like it does today. The next slide, please. This is the view again from that same corner from Lawton heading into the linear park that's snaking its way all the way to Park Place. On the right side, you're seeing a lot of the dense foliage that exists today and supplemented with shrubs and planting on the ground. And on the left side, you're seeing the proposed new planting on the left side of the path, along with the lamppost to illuminate the path. Next, please. Here's some renderings from the plaza. This is from the back of the plaza, kind of looking towards Broad Street and looking towards the Whole Foods corner entrance. Nothing really has changed materially in this view. It's still pretty much the same. You can see the two levels of the plaza, the lower level and the upper level, and how they kind of, this almost kind of like a theater effect where you have kind of like a balcony zone sitting up higher and kind of looking at the urban scenery out there. So we kind of like how this is coming out, and it's very similar to the way we conceived it originally. Next view, please. This is then the view of the plaza. This is from kind of the corner of Broad and Washington, but on the sidewalk and kind of looking at a vista between the planting and the stones and the trees at the plaza and the lawn, and of course the building in the background. Again, no change at all in this concept. Next, please. We include the elevations, and at staff's request, we outlined all the areas that have had changes and kind of included notes as to what those changes are, so it's clear what's actually been changed. And again, most of these are material changes or slight changes to the massing, like we've described just now on the views, but generally the massing, the colors, the materials are very similar to what was approved in the CDP. Same thing on the east and west elevations. There's really not a whole lot of difference. On the Lawton Street side, you can see where the material has changed from hardy panels to brick. Next, please. Actually, I think this was the last slide, but I think I heard, and maybe it's worth looking at the next few slides. We did include some of the parking plan slides, and I can identify where we're showing these compact spaces. I can also show where the columns are not 3 feet away from the drive aisle. Actually, could you go to the next slide, please? Next up, please. Yeah, there you go. One more. Yeah, so this is the P3 level. This is the Park Place level. This is where all the green spaces are Whole Food spaces. So you're going to pass through an access control to get into these spaces. The red, if somebody can point, the red boxes are showing where the columns are not 3 feet away from the drive aisle. They may be less than 3 feet. They're not zero. Maybe in some cases they are zero, and I'll explain why that is the case. Some other conflicts are where we have a stair coming down. So, for example, on the right side, somewhere in the middle, you can see there's a corner of a stair that's next to a parking spot. It's hard to, I can't chop off that stair. The stair is a stair, it has to go down. So sometimes if there is a parking space next to that stair, there's just no way to provide that 3 foot from the drive aisle. There's the same thing happening where we have the elevator core for the residential in the middle of the building, closer to Broad Street. Emily, if it's possible, you can move your mouse to the left. Thank you. Yeah, right there. That's a residential core. These are elevator cores that are going straight up. It's hard to jog those to make it work on this level. So and we have a parking spot just to the right of it. So it's hard to kind of make that adjustment there and provide the 3 feet. The last place is really at the bottom left corner where you're seeing those two columns that are being affected. It's really that whole bank of columns that are along the Whole Foods vestibule. And the thing with the vestibule is if we push those columns in 3 feet, well, the problem is those columns will end up being in the middle of the escalators. We have escalators, we have cartilators, we have stairs, we have elevators. There's a lot going on here that has to communicate between not just the parking level and the store, but there's also the mezzanine. So there's a lot going on here. This is quite a complicated building. So the problem is in this area, we just had to push those columns along the drive aisle. Now on this floor, it only really impacts those 3 spaces, or rather 2 spaces around that column. But the impact of this is really seen at the G level, or rather the below grade level where the residential is parking. That's residential is different. People who are parking there every day. They're a little bit more familiar with what's happening in that garage level, and there's a level of comfort there, and that's not going to be a difficulty. People get used to parking into spaces, and the impact of pushing these columns out because of the vestibule is really going to be felt at the residential parking level and not the public parking level. So I think that's a good positive thing. There's one column that you're seeing that's very close to Park Place. Now that is, unfortunately, we can't move that column because right below there is Whole Foods loading. Now here's the thing, it's like there's a balance. It's great that we don't have this loading, these giant trucks backing in and reversing in public streets. All that movement's happening inside the building, but something's got to give. These are big trucks. The amount of space they need is not easy to travel, and it's very hard where you can place your columns and how you can move your columns. So it's unfortunate with the way the orientation is of the entrance that we can't move that one column to give the 3 feet clear. So again, you can see these are minor isolated incidences around the building, and much of it is because this really is a complicated building with a lot happening inside it. We can go to the actually before we go to the next level, you're also seeing these little C, capital C's. Those are the compact spaces that you're seeing. Thank you. So there's on this level there's 4. I think in the whole building, out of like I don't know what 700 spaces, I think we have maybe 19 compact spaces. So that's like maybe, I don't know, 1%, 2% of the spaces. So there's not a whole lot. These spaces are 8 feet 6 by 16 inches. 8 feet 6 by 16 feet. You know, in most jurisdictions, like, I mean, this is not where you park the Fiat 500. No, you can park a Honda Civic. You know, you can park a Jeep Wrangler. I mean, there's a lot of cars that can actually go into these spaces. They're not meant for just those tiny smart cars. But yes, can you park a Chevy Tahoe in there? No, please don't. But again, on this level, the impact is going to be felt only on, like, say, Thanksgiving Day. These spaces are really, really far away from the Whole Foods vestibule. Most of the people who are entering this particular part of the project are going to be, you know, trying to huddle and find a space near the vestibule. So, you know, Thanksgiving Day, you know, when the grocery stores are most busy, yeah, sure, those spaces will get used, but the impact of those spaces is going to be very little. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is the P3 level. You're seeing, again, there's only 3 conflict areas where we're not able to push the column away from the drive aisle. One of them is because of the stair. The other 2 are, again, complications. Right below there is where we have the Whole Foods loading. We just can't move those columns and make it work. So that's why we're having issues in those spaces there. And then there's 3 compact, actually 4 compact spaces on this level, not a whole lot. Next slide, please. So this is the P1 level. Again, there's not a whole lot of conflict. There's just that one conflict with the stair coming down, and then there's one compact space at the top right corner. Next, please. This is the below grade. This is the residential level where a lot of the public are not going to be parking as such, and you can see that bank of columns that are basically, you know, holding up the Whole Foods vestibule and the building above, and there's just no way we could push that in. So, you know, that's kind of where you're seeing the impact, and then of course you're seeing the impact because of the stair and the elevator core, and I think there's 4 compact spaces on this plan. So again, they're distributed, they're spread out. You know, it's not like 50% of the project is compact spaces. It's just 19 spaces, I think, for our last count. So there are a few areas where it's unfortunate. It's a complicated building. There's a lot happening inside it. There's a lot of complicated program being stacked. So, you know, I wish we could make it work, but in some areas we're just unable to do so structurally. That's all.
But before we take questions, I wanted to, if you don't mind going back to slide 11, I'll address Mr. Stevens' questions about the vents a little further. This is the image Neville mentioned where you're standing at Lawton Street looking into the park. The ledge along the left, kind of behind that first big tree, it's about a little bit higher than the people. That behind that ledge is where those vents are that Ed mentioned. So they are above the height of a typical human. They're grates that you won't see, and that's what's exhausting the garage up into the air above. But like Ed said, it's very minimal fan volume almost all the time, and it's the same category of exhaust as a dryer or a toilet or kitchen exhaust.
Can I add one more thing here? The garage exhaust fans, the fans are not at the vents. The fans are actually deep into the garage. The P3 level is being exhausted separately, and the rest of the garages are being exhausted separately. So sure, sound carries. Basically, this is a shaft that's leading to the vent outside. So, that will still dampen some of the sound, whatever sound exists. But I just want to point out that the fans are not at the vents. There's one other thing. So these vents here, you will never see them. Just as Maury and Ed said, yes, they are high up, but I do want to point out that the generator, I don't want to say exhaust, but the generator room is below in this area, and it is, it's powered by gas, as you know. The thing is, it needs air cooling. So it's not like there are fans or anything. It just there's I think maybe there may be little fans to help with airflow. But the airflow is it's not going into the generator. It's just to cool the generator, just air flowing over it, and then there's an intake and there's an outtake. That will be facing this way, if I'm not wrong. I don't know if there's a way for us to expose them like we're doing to the sky with the garage exhaust, because water is going to get in, and this is the generator room. It's not going to work that way. With the garage exhaust, it's different. At the bottom of the shaft, we can put a drain. So the generator exhaust is different. It's not really exhausting generator. It's just to air cool it, to keep the temperature of the generator, at a constant space, so it's not seizing up. The generator will have a flue potentially, just like it's no different than the boiler in your house. It's probably powered by gas, and there's a flue, and that goes up through your building and exhausts at the top, and it's once it gets up there, it's in the atmosphere, it's dilute enough. There's very little products of combustion that you have to worry about. That flue is not being exhausted here. That flue is going through the building and getting up into the courtyard. So it's just environmental air, as Ed and Maury have said before. But I just wanted to provide additional detail on that.
And with that, I think we're happy to take your questions, comments.
Okay, I see Ms. Teets, although I don't know, Mr. Stevens, your hand was up first, but.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on the vent question. Now that we see where it is, I just understand why it has to be right there. I mean, we have minimal green space on this project, and why couldn't it be higher up where, towards the top of that structure? Why does it have to be in the middle, kind of like that? Is there engineering reason for this?
No, we can take it up, but then that means, you're going to have an object that's going to be, like they're trying to reduce the height along this stretch. And, the 40 feet, we're trying to maintain that. We don't want to create an additional structure that's going to make this building appear closer to 107 Lawton Street. So we don't see the point in that. It's better that this is 7 feet and above. So at least about there, you're still seeing that it's open, instead of having a 20-foot wall out here just to take it higher up. There's no danger. I mean, it's really just air.
Okay.
It's yeah.
How wide is that shelf? Is it coming out from the building here?
I may have to measure it. I'm guessing 8 feet, 8 to 10 feet,
okay.
Probably.
Yeah, it doesn't look in the drawing. It doesn't give you that impression. It gives you an impression of maybe being 3 or 4 feet. So I see what you're saying.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. If it was 2 feet, we were taking it straight up. You're right.
Yeah, and as Ed mentioned, we met with a lot of neighbors on Monday, and this was one of their main concerns. And I think once we were standing right here, actually on the site, and showed them where this was in both horizontal and vertical dimension, it felt like everyone else was very comfortable now, understanding that it wasn't at grade and that there was building facade essentially along that wall. So I think that added some comfort that they could see it in person and understand, because we agree the plans did not do justice to how this actually functions.
Yeah, it looked much more industrial. And I think that's the thing, is that the amount of green space in this project is limited. We don't have as much tree coverage as the urban forestry people pointed that out. So it's just kind of annoying to have these engineering structural air things in the area that's supposed to be the limited green. So we've lost 8 feet of plantings for this thing, basically then. So it kind of dampers the value of it to me.
Yeah. One other
To
thing.
some extent, well, just sorry, no, to some extent, but in the approved CDP, we did have transformers here that stuck out about that same 8-foot dimension. Not as long, I agree, but there was a section here at the corner that was fenced with transformers that now is that shaft coming up.
Yeah, it's kind of give and take, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah,
This is probably more attractive than that, but I would say this takes up more planting space. But yeah, but you're right. They didn't want the transformers either. So
Yeah. One other thing, one tiny thing I want to point out is that, as Ed said, the garage will have the garage exhaust. Some of those fans will be working at a very low speed, but the generator is not turning on every day. The generator is only turning on when you're testing it, which I don't know what it is, maybe once a month or something, and you have to run it for like half an hour, or during emergencies, right, when the whole city loses power or the building loses power. So again, the generator vents are not active like, say, the garage exhaust. So, again, that really does reduce the impact. Like, it's just there and it gets used when there's a true emergency or when we're testing, and which is for a short period of time. But other than that, it's like there's nothing else there other than just a wall and some greenery against it. So just want to point that out too.
yeah, no, I understand the sound issue. Like, there's not much of a sound issue. I think I'm just more upset about losing that much planting space. That's basically it.
I think you just answered the question I was going to ask about how often the generator would be running. So sounds like it's pretty minimal.
Okay, let's see. All right, I see other hands are popping up. Ms. Come go ahead.
Can I just ask one quick question while we're on this slide? Is there a connection from the pedestrian path to Lawton Street at the north end here?
Well, this is looking from Lawton Street. This is looking from Lawton Street going into, and then you're going to turn to the right and finally find yourself up on Park Place. So you can walk from Park Place to Lawton or from Lawton to Park Place.
So you can access the pedestrian path from Lawton?
Yes, it's basically public, right? I mean, it's anyone can walk through that space.
Mr. Prentice, your hand is up.
Thank you. I had a question about in the TDM plans. You have a whole section here on managed parking. Can you describe what you mean by managed parking? And then I had a couple questions to answer that. I guess it's not you all, it's the whoever this company is, Grove Slade. But what do you mean by managed parking?
Kevin, you want to answer that, or you want me to?
Why don't you start, and I'll fill in some details as necessary.
So I think what I don't have it in front of me. I think what the term means is that we will manage the parking garage, and so we will have a company that we hire to oversee the management of parking, whether that's giving out monthly permits and access control to residents or other monthly parkers, and then enforcing the whatever agreement we come to with the city on the enforcement of public parking spaces and retail spaces. They will be responsible for that. And if there are any ticketing, not ticketing, but if you take a ticket or some other mechanism to get in and out of the garage and it's validated, they'll manage that process and collect any revenue associated with it. So that's the basics. But Kevin, feel free to jump in with any other details.
Yeah, just because there are multiple different components here with the residents, the what I'll call on-site retail parking, off-site retail parking because of the public nature. It will be one consolidated company that does all of that, but they'll have all those different components to manage, and they'll have to do that in different ways. And then really it's intended to make sure that there's no significant conflict between those, right? That people who are supposed to be parking in one place are parking in that place. It's less of a concern for the resident parking spaces because those will be nested with access control, but the others will have to be more actively managed through personnel.
So it's not demand management, really, it's more enforcement.
Correct.
You made the comment about, at some point, I think it was in reference to the grocery store, that you're going to have to pass through access control. So is this, and then there's a line in here about smart parking technology being incorporated in revenue controls. Basically, what I'm trying to get to, is there going to be, and I hope there is, going to be paid parking here?
So that's the concept we put forward is to use technology, whether it's something like Park Mobile that we all know, it has functionality that's applicable to garages to control how long people park, whether it's free or not, how much is charged, if it is charged. It also has the equivalent of validating a ticket functionality. That's what we put forward to staff as sort of the revenue collection and enforcement mechanism along with our staff. We have not come to any agreement yet, as Akita mentioned, that we've decided to push that down the road as technology evolves and other changes in car habits to resolve that prior to first C of O. But that's our intention, is to use some sort of technology to manage the enforcement and the revenue, and to decide, use the term demand management to do some of that to flex the spaces as demand changes for one use or the other, obviously within the constraints of the proffers and the way that the garage is designed.
Sure. Thank you. It doesn't matter to me where the revenue goes necessarily, but it seems odd that it's not. There isn't an agreement about that now, because I think a key part of the parking management strategy would be whether or not it's paid parking or not. So, because if it's free, it's very different than if it's paid parking. So it does seem odd that that's not a key component. I think that actually would be a neat innovation, especially for our city. There's another innovation in here, and I'm sorry I lost it. You mentioned something about decoupling parking from the residential units. So if you're going to have the option as a resident to not have parking, and then you would have a lower rent, lower cost for your residential unit.
It's a good question. Yeah, so it means that we charge rent for an apartment, whether if it's a 1-bedroom apartment, whether you have parking or not, you're paying that same rent for that 1-bedroom apartment. If you have a car and want to park your car, there's a separate monthly charge for parking. So there's not, when you rent a unit, you're not getting a space with that unit. You're getting that apartment unit, and then if you want parking, you're separately renting for an additional fee the parking space.
Right.
I think that's great. I think that's great. I think it's a key component of keeping units relatively affordable, and a key component really to making this true. I mean, there's a lot in this TDM plan. It doesn't seem to be a whole lot of innovation in here. Otherwise, it's a lot of aggregation of stuff that's already there, bus stops, crosswalks, like that. But those two pieces, I think, are pretty important as we go forward. Thanks for that.
Okay, Ms. Kama, your hand popped up.
Yeah, I actually had two other questions about the TDM plan. So I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Puentes' comments. The TDM plan mentions in a couple places that a shuttle could be run, or that smart trip cards with $20 preloaded can be handed out to new tenants. So I'm just wondering, it struck me a little bit like this is a menu of things that the developer could consider doing. And so I'm just wondering, what are you actually committing to?
Yeah, so I think and I'll let Maury talk about any progress on some of this, but I think the idea is to make sure that there is active marketing and active encouragement of transit use. I know we talked pretty early on and fairly continuously over the last several years about the possibility of getting a shuttle to the metro station, but that would only really make sense if there were other participants with that. So barring that as an actual service that can be stood up, then we think that the paid metro fare cards would be the right way to encourage that. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Maury.
No, I was going to say something similar, that I don't know that we can commit at this time to a shuttle. So I think if I would prefer to commit to something. I agree with you. I'd prefer to not have a menu of options, to just commit to something. So we've had a lot of success with whether it's a $20 smart trip card or some $20 for zip car, or whatever the option is. Rather commit to that than a shuttle that we may, or more than likely will not be able to provide. So I agree. We can better provide it rather than a menu, a specific item that we will be offering.
That would be great. Thanks. And then I have one more question on TDM. Maybe it's more for staff. So a lot of these TDM plans mention that there's going to be annual reporting. I'm wondering, are you all receiving those reports? I don't think I've ever seen one. I'm just curious if that's actually happening after these developments are built.
I think a lot of times what we have in the reports is that the TDM coordinator would be available to meet with the city's TDM coordinator, I think on a regular basis, and like you said, do some reporting. I think the idea of the report was to get building owners to run a survey, or building managers to run a survey of the residents. How are how many trips a day are you taking? Do you own a car? Do you take transit around? Do you walk bike for your daily needs? To get some survey of how are people actually traveling to and from the site. We had a grant-funded effort to help with that survey a couple of years ago. We weren't quite able to get it completed before we ran through the grant funds, and we don't currently have anyone on staff to actually run the city's TDM program.
So, okay, I guess maybe I'm a little unclear. So is that annual reporting is something that the developer provides or something that the city provides?
It is something that the developer would provide. I think one of the things we were trying to do is make sure we get a standard report from everyone, because I think if we ask someone for a report, they produce one, they have to. But I think the goal was to get one that was in sort of a useful form, and that we could look at it sort of across projects and making sure we get the same data from everybody. But certainly a starting point is just to go out and reach out to folks that are supposed to be reporting and ask them for that.
Yeah, that would be great. I feel like, I think it would be great for us to have this data about how people are. Even the table that's been included in a few different reports that shows the parking usage, the actual parking usage, has been really informative for our decision making on how much parking we should be asking for, right? So we need that data from these developers to help better inform future decision making about projects. So I always see that in these TDM plans, and I've never actually seen one. It's like this mythical thing that I've never seen. So it would be nice for them to actually follow through on creating those and providing that data.
Understood.
That's it.
So I don't know if Mr. Stevens was first or Mr. Puente is back again, but Mr. Stevens, why don't you go?
Okay, although Mr. Puente, I'll let you indicate whether or not it's okay. All right. A few more questions. For someone pulling in on the P3 level, if they see that those 10 spaces or so that are there, the public spaces are full, will there be an electronic display to indicate whether or not there are open spaces and the ones that are on the 2 level?
We had not contemplated an electronic display. The concept was you enter on the P3 level. If those 10 spaces are occupied, you continue down. And the way the garage is currently designed is there's no delineation between the mezzanine level below this, between the public spaces and the retail. They'll be marked as public versus retail, but there's no barrier, there's no gate. So the idea would be we'd want people to go down and try to park in the public, but if not, they are welcome to park in the retail under whatever kind of restrictions we have as far as pay or not pay and time limits. So we weren't contemplating an electronic display. We wanted to encourage people to come down and continue through the level, but it's something we can consider if the concern was preventing someone from driving through and realizing there's absolutely no parking available.
Yeah, I've seen those over at, for example, the Mosaic. I'm sure they're in other places. Probably would be helpful. Like, just imagine some people might get frustrated if they go down to the next level and say, oops, they're all full. So yeah, I think, and especially since the technology seems to be getting a lot better these days to help out on that. So that may be something to consider.
Sure.
Will the building be all electric as far as the appliances in the units go?
Yes.
That's good. Okay, I was very, very pleased to hear that. I think that going forward is a good greenhouse gas mitigation technique, because the electric utilities increasingly are going to have meter power, so that will help. On the lead score sheet, I noticed that there were 2 points for carbon offsets. By any chance, do you know how those offsets will be obtained or who they're going to be obtained from? I realize that's a pretty obtuse question, but I thought I'd throw it out and see if you know the answer.
I certainly don't know the second part of your answer of who they'd be obtained from. We've done this on a number of projects, and I have to admit I'm not as up to speed on the process or exactly, but in other jurisdictions, like for example in the district, we've purchased solar offsets through companies like Constellation or others, but I'd just be speculating at this point on how we're planning to do that here, and I'm not by any means the expert on that.
Okay, if that answer does happen to come up, I'd be curious about that later on. Sure. So I think that is all I had. So thank you very much. I think the project is coming along very well, and hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel. Thanks.
See, I think Mr. Weiss, you're next.
Yes, thank you. I would certainly like a follow up on that conversation, the question about carbon offsets, by the way, if it's carbon offsets or procuring energy attribute certificates to cover the electricity in the building, which is my guess is. But I just wanted to follow up, really sort of inspired by the Urban Forestry Commission resubmitting their letter. You know, one of the required considerations for a site plan is adequate landscaping, and I think by them resubmitting that letter, they're telling us that they don't believe there is adequate landscaping in this site plan. And also, you know, when we look at the downtown small area plan, it's clear that there's more green space contemplated. So I was wondering if you could answer some of the questions that was posed by the Urban Forestry Commission. What is the tree canopy percentage likely to be, first of all? Second of all, you know, are there any opportunities to include the greenery in the existing public spaces or private spaces? And third, you know, that facade from Park Place remains pretty stark. So have you contemplated, you know, I was disappointed that we didn't get a green wall in there. I mean, that's a pretty harsh facade to look at when you're coming down Washington Street. So I was wondering if you had any ideas or thoughts about how to improve that facade with greenery in response to the Urban Forestry Commission's letter.
I'll let Steve Sattler, our landscape architect, try to address at least the first couple comments on urban forestry and the canopy, and I can jump in others.
So I don't think we have necessarily we don't have the canopy coverage numbers offhand. Certainly we can look at those, but you know, I think in particular in the back Passage Park, we're looking at preserving a number of trees. We're preserving the trees on Lawton, and there are a number of constraints in the park in terms of the stormwater lines that come through and easements on those, and in addition, quite a few of the trees from the neighboring property overhang the property line. So we've been looking more carefully at how, I guess, existing trees versus planting new trees that would then compete with existing trees would work. And so perhaps some of the comments coming from that are related to that. Certainly we're looking at lushly planting all of the open spaces that we do have and trying to, make a pleasant space for the public as well as the residents that would also use these spaces.
And I'd also add that we are meeting with the arborist tomorrow, I guess it is, to talk about the canopy coverage along 107 Lawton and the issue Steve raised of preserving the existing buffer, which would be the owners of 107 Lawton's preference versus meeting the canopy coverage in that area. So that is a topic we were discussing. Unless Steve has it, I'm not sure that we necessarily have that 2019 letter handy. I mean, I don't know that it was transmitted to us unless we missed it in the staff comments. So we will ask staff to send that to us again, because I'm not sure we're 100% up to speed on what those specific issues are that have been raised.
It's posted in the meeting materials for tonight, which is why I was reading it thinking it was a recent set of comments, but it was apparently resubmitted. Can someone speak to the facade facing Park Place?
I'll let Neville.
Yeah, which facade is it? Is it the north face of? Is the north face along Park Place?
The north face, the wall sort of overlooking Clarendon's and Thompson Italian.
So the west face, that's kind of looking over the transformers, and it's of the 3-story residential portion, right? I mean, that whole facade, what's happened is we had to push this whole massing away from Park Place by another 20 feet, which is kind of what got the whole parking thing started there. But what that's done is reduced that face length to maybe 50, 55 feet. It's really not a big portion. The views, it's easy to focus on it, but in real life, 50, 55 feet is going to feel like nothing. We do have that facade articulated at the corner where there is a different color and different style of siding that provides visual texture and a difference visually. And then we also have that the poster or the mural. Actually, can somebody go to that? Emily, is it possible to go to? Yeah, thank you. I think a couple. We discussed this at the AAB too. This one, yeah. So what's happening is, so you have, correct.
Can we see the one that's overlooking? I think there was another shot that was overlooking Clarendon's and Thompson Italian.
This
That's
one,
it.
Yeah. And again, remember, like I said, this is a 2-dimensional view taken from a computer model. Sometimes, like the human eye cannot even see that much. When you're actually, I mean, peripheral vision is different, but actual vision is different. So computer models, it's really hard to understand this. And if you look at this with VR goggles, you'll see a very different kind of building. But yes, in this view, unfortunately, it appears flat, but that's barely 50, 55 feet. It's articulated at the corner where the corner architecture turns the corner. That's a different siding. And then you have that one bay of window, and then you have this black and white kind of poster, which is just a placeholder for a mural or something to celebrate Falls Church. And we used to have a balcony zone, but that balcony zone got taken away because this whole facade from Park Place got pushed in further to the right. And there's just no place to make that work. It's really impacting the work from home units in there. It takes up valuable space. And again, this whole mass, as it hits that black tower-like element, there's a balcony zone there. So it's not flat there. It turns the corner. You have the balconies. You'll get shade, shadow. So, from this angle, from so far, it's very hard to make out the back, and it's very hard to make out the visual texture on the facade. Unlike the previous one, if you can go back to that facade, can you go back to the next one? Thank you. Out here, you start to see the intensity of the patterns, and you see how the patterns are slightly different, and it's actually referencing kind of metal standing seam and flat seam kind of architecture. So there'll be enough visual texture. You can see at the corner we have horizontal siding actually, the grays at the top and the bottom, and then in the middle it's that darker orange kind of color. So there will be sufficient visual texture. We're not worried about it. It's really a small, cute little portion of the building that we really like. It's like the baby addition to the big building. So I hope I was able to shed some light on our thinking there. We think this is just appropriate. It's. I wish I could give you an example of what 50 or 55 foot long facade looks like, but it's not that big. If I'm not wrong, I think City Hall is 163 feet long. So this is like not even half that size. If I'm not wrong, I may be wrong, but that's
I guess the specific question was less about that visual differentiation. With your explanation was helpful, but more in response to the Urban Forestry Commission's request for a green wall.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Steve, can you make green walls grow on fiber cement siding?
So, if I could, green walls have become a very popularized thing. I think the reality of them is quite different than what we think of. The idea of growing green on a structure like this is actually quite technologically difficult. It requires computers, irrigation, fertilizer, quite a lot of technological support. And in addition, on a north-facing facade could be quite difficult and possibly catastrophic in that, it might not actually live. We've had requests on many projects for green walls, and the reality of them has been difficult, to say the least, to implement.
Let's see. I'm sorry, is it Ms. Rice? Are you still up? I'm trying to see who's Mr. Howard, your hand is up. You haven't spoken yet.
I know I've been quiet for so long. I've really enjoyed the discussion. Everyone has lots of really good comments about green space, parking spaces, the facades, the vents. I just want to say that, again, overall, I'm so pleased with this project. I think it's going to be just a great thing for our city in this location where there's some vibrancy, but we're going to take it, I think, to the next level in a big way. And the thing is, again, I just want to underscore, you guys know, I mean, pretty much when I talk, it's always going to be about affordable housing, that we are getting affordable housing as well. And I'm just wondering if there were any changes. I've been tracking sort of the conversation, which has been ongoing for quite a while about this development, but in particular, the affordable housing component. And I know there's still maybe some unresolved issues or just some tweaking and continued conversation. And I was just hoping we could get an update if there is any on the affordable housing front. And I ask that, but also want to put the caveat that I'm very pleased where the conversations of the past have gone, and knowing that we can do economic development and also equitable development, in that we are providing affordable housing in this development. So,
to answer your question,
or the development.
Nothing has changed since we last came before you in July, but this was resolved, and staff may be able to speak up better than I do the process. But we had a baseline affordable mix approved in the voluntary concessions that had 9 studios at 40% and 9 2-bedrooms at 60%, and then we offered up several additional options for affordable housing, and the city council voted for the option to add 15 80% studios. And so that is what is in this site plan submission, and that's what was approved by the city council. So from where I sit, there are no additional changes. We are following what the city council approved earlier this year.
I think I'm still on, right? Yeah. Well, that's great. Because I do know that as these things take time, and often things that have been agreed to can change, and to hear that there is no change. I mean, the fact that we're going to get some at 40% AMI, that's huge. I can see the people that have those units wanting to go out on that porch where there was the swing and just sit and chill. And I want to be there with them. So it looks great. So thanks.
Let's see. I mean, there's not much more I'm going to add. I mean, I think, we've had a good discussion on many points. I mean, I'll get back to what I said at the very beginning. I wonder why, since, I mean, we're getting a park, you guys are going for a parking reduction. So it's more just like a question. Why would you submit and take the extra time and energy to go through the variance process at the BZA for, as was said by the architect, a relatively small number of spaces? I mean, why not just reduce the parking, and avoid the need for, maybe, I think, some of them it's the column location, sometimes it's the width, but I just wonder why, since you're going for a reduction anyway, is it worth it to go to the BZA, for what seems like a relatively small number of spaces and ask for a variance for for those parking spaces?
I mean, it's a valid question for sure. From our perspective, we have more than enough parking spaces in the current plan. But as you know, it's been the hottest topic on this development, and we went through a lot of pains to add parking spaces above what was in the CDP, and the way to do that in some cases was compact spaces. And as Neville said, that in every other jurisdiction I've built in, compact spaces aren't a variance. It's allowed, and the norm, and well above the percentage that we're showing here. And the column spacing, as Neville said, is a lot more complicated. If we lost those spaces, I wouldn't have any pains over losing those spaces. But I think that a lot of the other stakeholders would. So I sort of put that back on the commission to advise us how to move forward in that respect.
I know there's different people pushing for parking, but I would argue that to any of those people pushing for parking, if the parking spaces are, substandard or not desirable, or I mean, some people there are smaller vehicles, it's true, that can use compact spaces, but the trend, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't want to be editorialized on it, but the trend has been that cars, a lot of cars in town are not smaller in general. A lot of families in town with large vehicles, and I just wonder, how useful the compact spaces will be. I mean, it's one thing, I guess, I know there are different constituencies out there that have been pushing for additional parking here for different reasons, and I certainly get that, but I don't know. I mean, to me, it seems, if you're at the point where, in order to provide that, you're having to go to the BZA for a variance, which, it's different than a waiver. There's a different standard to be met. I mean, the BZA may grant it, it may not, and it has to, and then if it doesn't grant it, what does that do to the site plan? I mean, it speaks to the timing as well. Maybe it's a question for staff. I mean, why is staff recommending that we act on the site plan prior to the BZA acting on the variance? I mean, can we approve a site plan that has things on it that don't meet, the ordinance? I mean, wouldn't the BZA need to act first before we could approve a site plan that has things on it that don't meet code?
We, at the staff level, we've talked through that in terms of the timing of a planning commission action and a BCA action on a variance request. Where we landed as staff is that if the applicant wanted to pursue this option of trying to get a variance for those spaces with the common creation and the compact spaces, I think the way we would structure this is that the planning commission would vote on the parking waiver that they've requested, and that would be a clean vote, and the site plan sheets wouldn't show any of the spaces as having these sort of compact spaces or column encroachments. And then it becomes a sort of a separate matter that on an approved site plan, the BZA is considering whether some of those spaces could have column encroachments or be compact spaces. So you guys would approve, as the planning commission, the spaces as if they were all regulation size. And then it would be up to the BZA to decide on the variance. I think it's complicated. I think the other path you're suggesting is just reduce the parking space, just reduce the overall number of parking spaces. If the applicant chooses to strike sort of the non-parking is parking spaces, that's up to them. But what the planning commission would be voting on is the number of, I think, regulation spaces is what you're suggesting.
Well, I mean, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. And honestly, I don't think we really can, I mean, I don't know, what the BZA were to do that, that's okay. But then wouldn't the applicant need to revise the site plan to show the change? If we approved it with the regulation spaces and then the BZA allows that and they have to restripe, I mean, wouldn't that now change the site plan? I mean, and require it to come back to us?
A change in the striping plan, I don't know, or a change in the column placement, I don't know that would necessarily come back to you all as a site plan issue.
I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I'd like to get a definitive answer on that because I think that's I think that process-wise, I don't know. I'm trying to think of another example where we voted on a site plan that had things that don't meet code or where the applicant was going to pursue a variance after that. We certainly have had cases where applicants have pursued variances, but I feel like that's happened before the site plan. I don't know. Signage maybe. There have been signage variances that come up afterwards, and that's perhaps different. But so I don't know. I have a concern about that just from a process standpoint. But again, the underlying issue is is it worth all this effort? I mean, I don't know where it's coming from. I mean, I'm not trying to step on people's toes that people have been pushing for a certain number of spaces, but at some point, I don't know. I just wonder if it's really worth all that effort for the semblance of parking, but without the actual, in fact, useful number of spaces. I mean, what are we really gaining? Who are we placating by saying that we have that number of spaces? And I don't know who that is. And I say who in a general sense. So that's my opinion on it. And honestly, I don't know if I would support a site plan that has non-conforming spaces on it, and especially if I knew they were going to pursue a variance. So that's just me talking, but that's kind of where I'm at on that issue. I feel like we're spending a lot of time on that, and it's and the staff report spent a lot of time discussing that, and to me it seems like we're stretching and twisting to try to, meet someone's notion of what number of parking spaces has to be on there. But if it requires these types of lengths to get there, I don't know. I don't know if it's worth it. Just food for thought, but I mean, as far as process goes, though, I'd like to get an answer before we have to hear this again on that issue of process about, if the BZA approves a variance, does that trigger the need for a site plan amendment? Because if it does, then there's really no point, in my view, to act before the BZA. Ms. Coleman, I see your hand is back up. Is that left over from before, or do you have something, David?
Yeah, I do have one other thing. Sorry, I just remembered I wanted to ask about. But on your point on the spaces, I mean, if you have 19 substandard spaces, you wouldn't lose all 19 of them. I mean, maybe you just remove one of the group of 3 or whatever. So I don't know. It doesn't seem. I'm with you on. I'd rather have fewer, better spaces, especially if we're talking about really small numbers, but that's just me. I wanted to ask about the conduit though. I remembered. So I guess I'm a little confused about how many, can you remind me again about the charging stations, how many charging stations are and how much conduit you'll have for future charging stations?
So my recollection is 14 charging stations up front and then conduit for 15 additional.
And each station charges 2 vehicles, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so you have charging for 60 vehicles? Okay,
No,
so that's about...
Sorry, but it's for, those are the number of spaces, is what I said
Oh,
earlier.
that's the number of spaces. Sorry
60
about
spaces?
No, sorry, Ed, you were saying that those were the number of spaces, not the number of charging units.
Correct.
Okay. Sorry, so 31 spaces total.
Okay, so you started with 5 stations and that would have charged 10 vehicles, and now you've added a 10 additional stations, or it's 10 additional stations that could eventually conduit for 10 potential future additional stations, is that right? So our Environmental Sustainability Council, they recommend that 5% of spaces, they recommend stations for 5% of spaces, which in your case would be, 30 spaces? If you have 600 or so spaces total, plus conduit for 50% of the spaces in the garage. So it doesn't sound like you're anywhere close to that. Is that right?
No, I'll jump in. No, that's something we obviously addressed during the CDP process. And so we are exceeding what was approved in the voluntary concessions during the CDP process.
So it sounds like we need to do a better job of paying attention to the recommendations of our Environmental Sustainability Council at that point in the process. I mean, I think you're all well aware that gas power vehicles will probably be phased out here in the next 15 to 20 years. It just seems a little short-sighted to me to provide such minimal amount of conduit in a building that will be around with us for much longer than that.
Yeah, I will say it's a much larger issue. The issue becomes the power capacity to handle 50% is significant. And I'm not sure any building has that capacity right now, but I hear you. We all are thinking about that as things change, and that's why we've asked for a lot of the flexibility we've asked for in parking counts and parking uses, because it is going to dramatically change. We agree.
Yeah, I totally support that. And maybe 50% is too high. But 5% I think is maybe where you are now. That seems too low. That's all. Thanks.
Mr. Stevens, your hand is back up.
On this issue, let's say you're 10 years down the road and all of a sudden, you're exceeding the capacity. Since these are all rental units, I mean, you're not going to charge to the unit owner if you've got very small conduit, right? I mean, that's just an expense that you as the landlord would have to undertake.
Correct.
So, it really is kind of almost your call as to what you see as,
Yeah, I agree, and it's something is not unique to this project. We're going to adapt over time, and whether we're starting at 5% or 0%, we're going to have to make changes to any building over time as EV usage increases.
Right. Mr. Chair, I just had one other quick question. I was just curious about the recycling and composting program for the residents.
Neville or Ed, I don't know if you want to answer that one.
I can show you where the trash is. I don't know. I think composting, I remember that the City of Falls Church runs a composting program, but I don't know if any details have wiggled down to the building plan level. But if you can go to the P1 level plan, please. I think it's slide 20. One more. Yes, this one. If you can zoom in. all of the trash, all the loading, everything's happening in the center of the building. Actually, you may have to zoom in a little bit more. So the grocer has its own loading and its own trash. The residential building has a trash chute that, and a big trash room that's just left of the res lobby. Thank you very much. Yes, that's exactly where it is. And then trash gets pulled out on trash day, and the trash truck comes and parks with that gray boxes that says res loading. And you know, they're probably going to be bottom loaders that just kind of chuck the trash into the back of the van. There is a red rectangle to the left of that gray loading area, which is where the retail, the rest of the retail, that's not Whole Foods. Yes, that trash, it's along, you know, on the right side of the wall, Whole Foods exactly. That's where retail trash bins are going to be located. And again, that's where the truck comes in and takes the trash away. All loading for res and retail also is happening in that location. So really, it's kind of like a centralized location for the whole building. It's kind of convenient for residential, all the levels up, as well as horizontally between all the retail. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, I mean, the city historically has been pretty active in the recycling, and here in the last 5 years, composting as well. So I have no doubt that the residents of this building will be asking at some point, you know, what can we have as far as recycling and composting? So it'd be good to think about that.
For what recycling we do have. We have a trash chute and recycling chute in that room that Neville pointed out handles both. And same with Whole Foods. They will have a recycling. They actually do a great job of almost no trash at all, either recycled or composted from their loading dock. If the city has a compost program, we will be the first to sign up. But if not, we do in most of our buildings provide composting through a third party service. Usually the container where people drop their compost is either in the loading dock or in the trash room that Neville showed on this level. We have not delineated a specific area, but that's something we will certainly do when the building's up and operational.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'd encourage that. Just like you say, in Falls Church, we have always had keen interest in those things. Thanks.
Okay. Well, at this point, I think we spent a good deal of time. Hopefully, we provided some feedback. I know we've raised some questions that I think need to be answered before this comes back again. We have a few weeks based on the schedule staff has laid out at this point. But otherwise, I think we've given you a good deal of feedback on the submission. I know you've worked hard on this, and I would echo, just to end on a positive note, I mean, the project has certainly progressed in a positive direction, and with every submission, even since approval, the details of the site plan have again improved, and it is going to be an excellent addition to the city. It's just, we're getting down to the final details here, which sometimes is difficult, but overall, I mean, I do commend you and the team for the progress you've made and on all fronts. And what is remaining is, not insignificant, but, much smaller than where things started. And this has been a long process. Anyone who knows this site, I don't have to explain that. So I guess with that, I mean, Mr. Stoddard will, this is scheduled to come back for action in November. And I guess pending some of the answers to my questions and maybe some others, we'll keep that as the target, and we'll see, where we go, and we'll look for a revised, submission from the applicant prior to that point. Mr. Stoddard, anything else, or is that about cover it?
No, that's everything. I appreciate, obviously, the discussion and the items, as you said, that need to be knocked out as the project gets down to this really detailed level. And that's really what the site plan is the sort of engineering details and design details that are going to make the project work. So I appreciate the discussion and direction on that prior to bringing this back for your all's final consideration.
Okay. Great. All right. Thank you, everybody. All right. Well, see, I jinxed us because Paul had us on that with his estimate of time, kind of blew that out of the water on the work session, which is not.
Somehow I'm right once and I'm wrong once, and I end up wrong overall. It seems like it should balance out.
Yeah, well, that's okay. I think in this case we had a lot of points to get across. It's an important project, so such as it is. Okay, so moving on to our final item of the evening, the CIP kickoff work session, which again, Mr. Stoddard will, or I know we have Ms. Nestor here, and this again is based on feedback from us over the last few years about having some input earlier in the process, so that by the time we get into the heart of the CIP season in the new year, we've had some input on the front end while we can still have more impact and as it's in its more formative stage. So I think that's kind of the idea, right, Paul? And the point of tonight is to introduce where things are in anticipation of looking at next year's CIP.
Yeah, you covered most of my intro. This is, this kickoff tonight with the Planning Commission is really the next iteration in increasing the level of engagement between staff and the Planning Commission in developing the CIP. The Planning Commission historically has always played a large role in reviewing, refining the CIP, making sure it's fiscally responsible, making sure it responds and delivers on the comprehensive plan. And over the last couple of years, we've been having this meeting between staff and the Planning Commission at an earlier calendar month. And then this year, for this cycle of the CIP, we're actually going to hold it in October, even before staff internally has started to draft the revisions to the CIP. The idea being that by getting direction from the Planning Commission now, that direction can be reflected in the CIP that's developed this cycle, versus waiting an entire cycle under the older model. As you can see in the request section, there's actually quite a lot of information. It is the quarterly update. It's a review on grant applications. It's the latest thinking on the use of ARPA funds, as well as we were saying the kickoff to the CIP. So with that, I'll actually turn off my mic and turn it over to Deputy City Manager Cindy Mester.
Thank you, Paul, and good evening, Chair and Commissioners. Glad to be with you, as always, to talk CIP. And I know we had a goal 2 years ago to do this. COVID got us quite delayed and off cycle for that, so I'm pleased we're able to have this input session this evening. That's the preliminary part, the primary part that I want to spend this evening on, but there were a few updates that we thought it would be helpful to give this evening to put all into context. And I do want to acknowledge I have Caitlin Sosby with me, who is our grants manager, as you know, and really helps on coordinating and managing and keeping all this together. And she did the lion's share of the preparation for tonight. So I thank her for that and glad she's able to join us. In your packet, you did get our traditional snapshot update. Due to the hour and that I really want to spend time on input from you all as I'm starting the staff work, I'm not going to go through those projects, but we certainly be glad to entertain any questions in the provision of those quarterly updates. It's been really positive. Through COVID, we've been able to keep projects going, sometimes challenging on getting the supplies and some of the contractors, but as you can see, we've got 25 projects active on the list, and 17 are green coded and going full strong. And you can see activity on South Washington as one example. And earlier this evening, Ms. Teese noted the NTC project on Little Falls, Great Falls as an example. And we did put in the report, the biggest CIP project, Meridian High School, and that ribbon cutting, the trails, and also very excited that the library. So we've done a lot on the facility side and keeping transportation projects out in the field happening as well. It also was a recently busy time for submitting grant applications. So coming to you all at this point, it seemed timely to provide you an update on that. Usually when we do the CIP, we do an update on new grants and pending grants, but this gives you a bird's eye view to the almost $13 million of grant applications we put in for revenue sharing and transportation alternatives. The rev share is always a good way to leverage local dollars. It's a 50-50 match. Needed projects, these are things that have been in the CIP, so we've put the funding application in. You will see a funding schedule of FY27, which is extremely far out, and that got pushed because of COVID and the state's revenue projections before the recovery started. So all localities are working with VDOT and hopefully the General Assembly going into the next session, because there is significant revenue recovery and surplus at the state level, both in the general fund and over 400 million in the transportation fund. So we think these should move forward and not stay so far out, because they have extensive contingency and inflation costs built into it, because we're trying to project, so far out. It also ties up our local money, because it's got to stay there to be matched for a project we can't execute for a while. Transportation alternatives is one that I did want to highlight, because it's Lincoln Avenue green infrastructure. This is, of course, one that the Planning Commission Council has heard from the community, the residents, CACT, ESC, everybody is really helping us to focus on green infrastructure. So this is a grant application we put in, which would also include pedestrian walkability and safety. I did want to flag this one simply because when we put it, we're planning to submit it to VDOT, it had both stormwater quantity and quality in it, along with the pedestrian safety. VDOT for this program disallows quality. And so we had to revise the scope. So when I talk about ARPA, you will see Lincoln Green Avenue show up again, because we're going that route for ARPA, because ARPA only allows quality. And so we're having a bit of a push-pull with our funding agencies on how they're addressing stormwater. So in my separate portfolio hat, we are working on legislation, as we did last year, to get at least the state money, because SLAF is more quantity, not quality, and VDOT is quantity, not quality. At least get the state aligned in the importance of both for mitigating inland and urban flooding. But very excited about these. We received positive input from VDOT on all these. They were pre-screened, and of course now we'll be waiting for the actual results of VDOT review and hopefully award in the next SIP. In terms of ARPA, lots happening there. So you have a summary in the staff report. We provided the preliminary allocation that council did. And then with the help of Emily today, we emailed out to you the information that went to council on Monday, because there was much more details on some planning for how we can spend this funding. So a lot of material there. So I'll give a synopsis, and then glad for questions and dialogues. This is really relevant to the CIP because one of the key categories that the federal government is allowing this recovery money to be used for is infrastructure, water, sewer, and broadband. And we worked really hard to get the Treasury to define infrastructure so that water and sewer included stormwater. So that's specifically called out now, even though you won't see it in the federal legislation. It is in the guidance. And that, of course, as you know, is very important to the City of Falls Church. And so we were looking for ARPA as how to help the CIP stormwater projects. We're also looking at ARPA as to how it can help pedestrian walkability and safety and those kind of infrastructure projects. And we're also looking at how it can address affordable housing. So one of the key things that council and staff have been focusing in is how can this help the health things we need now? The at-risk vulnerable population are having challenges with paying utilities, rent, food, and so forth. And then the other side of that coin on how to spend this funding is to make sure it has a long-term transformable impact on the City of Falls Church And in that regards, we're looking at infrastructure. So the city does have 18 million. We've actually received the first tranche of 9 million. It's available to spend as soon as we get through the community engagement and the budget appropriation process. And we have to spend this money till December 31, 2024. In terms of it has to be fully encumbered, and then especially if it's a construction capital type project, we actually have an additional 2 years to expend it, but it has to be encumbered by 2024. So we have the ability to be strategic and plan it, which is important, as you all know, for workload and staffing, because this is on top of an already really robust CIP that you saw last year. But it's also not to just sit there and not benefit the community as we recover from the pandemic health and economic impacts. So this council did just recently meet on Monday, as I mentioned. So when we put out the staff report, it was upcoming. Now it's happened. I provided you all the full report. Put in the staff report the links if you want to explore the U.S. Treasury guidance a little bit more on the state and local fiscal recovery funds. That's what the full name is for this local money. It is probably at least 200 pages of guidance between reporting and what's eligible. And we have about 1,700 pages of federal procurement. So one of the things that happens with this is, of course, we're federalizing projects. So that adds a little bit of challenge, but is certainly worth this resource. And Chairman, I'm going to pause there for a moment, and I see a hand up. Do you want to do questions as we go along, or what's your preference? Because I'm very open to interactive or getting the information out.
I think we could. I think that might be more productive to have more of a conversation. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Ira.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and it's great to see us do this long-term planning. It's also good to see that some of the federal appropriations are coming to our city, and now we've got some choices, but I know some of it is in certain categories. But I just have a couple questions. Like, so some of the recovery money is for housing, and I just noticed that housing is not part of the CIP. And I know that we have housing grants that we go after, but I think I said this last time when the CIP conversation came to us at the Planning Commission, is that, you know, other cities within their CIP have housing. And we, you know, things that we've done like the library and the school, which is great, but we floated bonds to do that. And some cities float bonds to produce affordable housing. And I just would highly recommend that we, within our CIP, place housing. Because it gets, I think, the staff, the council, and the residents of this city thinking about affordable housing in a long-term process. I know we think a lot about affordable housing in the sense that we just had a project, right? We just had a work session. We discussed we have development coming in, and part of the new development that comes in, we ask for contributions for affordable housing. But we're sort of doing that as development comes in, then we think affordable housing. Well, with the CIP, we should be thinking, how are we going to get funds from either the state government or the city government, and also utilize our own resources that we have and our bonding capacity to maybe contribute to, yes, we contribute to parks and libraries and schools, but I think affordable housing is another component of what makes a healthy, livable, sustainable, and equitable community. And I know these are all values that we have stated as a city. So again, I know I'm kind of going on and on here, but I've recommended this before and it's gone nowhere. So I'm curious to see what other planning commissioners and also the staff think about adding affordable housing into the CIP presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Affordable housing is extremely important, and we have been doing things like the ADUs and the mixed-use developments, as you noted, and recently working to apply for additional grants and proposing ARPA money for affordable housing, specifically around Virginia Village, and acquiring those units and making them committed affordable housing. So we have more of a continuum, and that would be at the lower income. I'll make a note and think through how we might be able to process it. The reason it's not in the CIP is a budget structure issue, in that we do not own and operate the affordable housing, so it's not a capital investment. It is in our operating budget in that we do have a special affordable housing trust fund, and this last 2 years, council did appropriate $100,000 to start feeding it. Cash in lieu would go in there, and we have the policies and the comp plan, as you all well know. So it's in the budget, but it doesn't get that same visibility and focus as the CIP, which I think, if I might be seeing your nods and your reasoning for bringing it up, is part of it. So I have a structural budget issue, and so maybe we can figure out a way how to make sure that special housing fund gets more prevalence, just like the CIP does. So I'll take a note of that. I'm going to have to think through a little bit more about how we might be able to work that, and I'll work with the CFO on that.
Thank you for that response. I'm just curious if other planning commissioners have thoughts on this, because I would say there are other cities, when you look at their CIP, they have housing as a category. I got crickets. Well, I do have some hands. I don't know if anyone's going to talk about affordable housing in the CIP. They're probably going to take it elsewhere, and that's fine. But I just throw it out there.
And I think I feel like we've talked about this before. I mean, it's this notion of doing it that way. And then it's come up.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I would be 100% for it. I feel like being more intentional and strategic in achieving our affordable housing goals makes a lot of sense. If we're being intentional and strategic and planning, doing very long range planning for transportation projects, I think we should be doing the same thing for affordable housing. It is also a physical part of our city. It helps it run. So I hope I understand the issues, but I hope, Ms. Mester, that you can think about how to solve them, because I do think it makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Thank you for raising it.
Yeah, in the vein of putting our money where our mouth is, I mean, everyone on council and on down spends a lot of time talking about the issue, and so, right, to the extent the CIP reflects, how the community wants to spend, scarce resources. I think it's important to provide. I mean, even if some years, what can be devoted to that fluctuates. I mean, just having it there as a category, is something that's of importance. So I don't know. Yeah, it's something to think about. I mean, again, I'm not as well versed on the structural limitations of what can be, that can be a full category in the CIP. In the same way, more traditional capital improvements are, but I know, as Mr. Hire said, it's not a totally novel concept. I'm familiar with other places doing things like that. Mr. Fuentes, go ahead.
I would support it too, for sure. I think maybe some of both the problem and the benefit is that we haven't really identified those capital expenses, right? Ms. Messer, I mean, from what I understand from what you described, you have it on the operating side, but it kind of would force us then to be very specific about those capital investments that we're talking about. So I think we can kind of get a twofer from this in some ways, and so I'm very supportive of the idea. Thanks.
Ms. Weiss, I think your hand was up next.
Yeah, I just wanted to support the idea as well. I have to confess, I was going back to the staff report to look at the definition of what goes into a CIP versus, an operating budget. It was further down. Yeah, there it is, right there. So new one-time projects? Is that so? I don't know if this is the time and the place for it, and I will say I'm not familiar with other cities' CIPs, but you know, to Mr. Puentes's point, like if we don't know, you know, like can we have a fund that doesn't have capital expenses attributed to it so we can be opportunistic when opportunities come along, or do we have to have the project first and then the budget for it? What comes first typically?
If I could jump in, and I love all these hands, but let me kind of respond to those 2 points since we're trying to have a virtual dialogue here, which I appreciate. There's 2 things. An added challenge for the City of Falls Church, per our charter, the city cannot own affordable housing, and generally your CIP is infrastructure owned by the public body. So I have that legal issue, which is why the EDA has purchased the recent Virginia Village units, because the EDA can own. The added challenge to our charter and part of the is that neither the city or EDA can operate affordable housing. So if you can't own and you can't operate it, it makes it structurally a challenge to put it in the CIP. So I'll think through that. We kind of have a hybrid model with WMATA. If you'll remember the WMATA line items, which obviously we don't own, but we are a legal member of the compact that operates it, so we are in a way an owner. We put part of the operating in there because it's so tied. We pay for their capital and their operating, and to bifurcate it, then nobody in the community would see the full cost of WMATA. So we put it in the CIP and kind of forced it. So I'll need to play with this a little bit. So I appreciate the dialogue to see what options we can do. We do have a dedicated housing trust fund, and that is in the operating budget as a special fund, just like we have the special transportation fund. So it has a dedicated place for money and resources to go into, but it doesn't have the same visibility as an operating budget for general government services, schools, or CIP. So, and I'm a longtime Loudoun County City of Falls Church advocate of affordable housing, so I'm really appreciate this conversation and that it's intentional, focused, and visible. So we'll think through, Mr. Fuentes, to your point, what we tend to do, because we don't own and operate, and we've been more reactive with grants like with Amazon and so forth. We haven't intentionally kept funding the Housing Trust Fund. And until recently, we didn't really have a project we're working on. So Virginia Village we're working on, we're hoping to consolidate all 20 units, redevelop down long-term, but in the meantime, maintain them as affordable. But we don't own it, and we can't long-term operate it. And then we got Field. So there's a couple projects out there that we know we can work on, but they're not quite fitting into the financial legal structure and charter of the city. So that said, even if it's not formally adopted in the city CIP, maybe there's a way that we can get it as part of your discussion so it's clear and visible and has a stronger message back to council when you make your recommendation. So the first year might be a bit of a hybrid, but we'll definitely work with that at the staff level and especially with finance.
Yeah, I really appreciate hearing, sorry to jump in, but hearing the details of our charter and whether we can own and operate housing. But you can, there are ways around that. I assume it's going to be very hard to change our charter, but at the same time, we should acknowledge our charter is written in that way to promote segregation. I mean, let's be honest here. We don't have a public housing authority. Many of the municipalities right around us do. Those are also the municipalities that have a CIP for housing. And we chose, in the trajectory of our community long ago, not to have a housing authority. But I think that the political dynamics and the ethos and for affordable housing is changing in the city. So I guess what I'm asking is, by elevating the CIP for having affordable housing, by having staff think creatively about, if we can't change the city charter, if there's not the political will for that, what are the other entities, like a community development corporation? Like there are other things that you could have that could put forward projects that the city can float resources for. right? I mean, we are floating resources for private development all over the place in this city. So if there's a will, there's a way, and I'm asking for a little bit more thought, and Cindy, you're giving that, and I appreciate it. And I know you're a proponent of affordable housing. I know many people on this planning commission care deeply about affordable housing, but we shouldn't look at past practices and look at that as a barrier, because those past practices of our city are based on racism, and we need to change that. And just by putting housing in the CIP, whether it fits with our operating, or it starts to signal to people that we're a city that cares about this issue and are thinking long-term and are thinking about our available resources and our fiscal capacity to potentially put resources towards that. Whether the city owns it or not, that really shouldn't be an issue, because we have other structures and other entities that can take on the burden of managing and even producing affordable housing within the city limits. So.
Excellent points. We have a formal agreement with Fairfax County Housing Authority as of July 1. It used to be with Arling. Now we're with Fairfax, and under state code, we can work with them. And if council asks, they can do affordable housing in the city. They happen to currently not be available, staff resources and so forth, because we were talking to them about Virginia Village. But to your point, we can be creative and go other routes, like working with a nonprofit. There's several in the region. There's one specifically interested in working with us on Virginia Village, and that's the way you can work around ownership, operating. You just got to get the right legal structure in to protect the city's long-term interests. So those are certainly things we're going to keep working on. And now you've given me some food for thought, and we'll think about how to structure it during the budget process as well.
Thank you.
See, Mr. Stevens, go ahead.
Okay, I guess I'm next then. Good topic. I wish we had a lot more time, but it's getting late, so
I can come back.
we may take you up on that. Let me give you three kind of concise things in response to your request memo, which was good. A lot of good information there. First of all, at a kind of a smallish level, kind of see the need for a signalized intersection at North Washington Street and Gresham Street or Gresham Place. It's kind of in the plan now, but it's kind of way out in terms of time frame. And one thing I've observed on that intersection is that there are people that will cross over from the west side of Washington Street to get to Isaac Crossman Park. And so, there's no real good area to cross right in that section. And then likewise, cars coming out on Gresham Place, it's kind of a real dance as to whether or not one considers it to be safe to pull out onto Washington Street. So I kind of see a need to pull that up higher, and especially since the CSL, FRF, ARPA does have some public safety components in it. Maybe there's a way to consider some funds for that. Second item, just my 2 cents on the reduced speed limit, the 100,000 for signage. Everything I've read indicates that you can't just rely on reducing the speed limit signs if you haven't re-engineered the streets themselves, because people will continue to drive at what seems to be the safe speed. That is to say, the design speed for the street. And of course, it puts kind of an unfair burden on the police department to be the enforcer for people who rightly are going to think, well, it seems like 30 or 25 is the way these streets are being designed, so that's what I should be driving. So what I'd like to see there is that we roll out a program to reduce the speed limits, which is absolutely necessary, but to combine that with the money to re-engineer the roads so that they are closer to a speed that matches what they're going to see on the sign. And then the third thing I had, I've been kind of tracking the greenhouse gas emissions from various jurisdictions in the region, and all the way from Rockville to Fairfax City to Arlington to Alexandria to DC they've all experienced reductions in their greenhouse gas emissions in the range of 15 to 20% over the last 10 years or so. I mean, they're still too high, but at least, they've been coming down. Whereas in the city, we basically just stayed the same. And so, clearly we're falling short in that area. And I'm wondering if one aspect that we can help to try to address that in the CIP is to set up an environmental section of the plan and begin to, put projects in there that deal with this issue. If indeed we're going to consider, climate change and greenhouse gas emissions to be the critical problem that it is, then we should be seeing it in the CIP. So anyway, I recognize it's late. I just wanted to touch on those three things for you, but thank you very much for the reports and the good information, and it's easy to follow the status of the various projects, so thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. And we have an environmental section, nothing in there, so we'll relook at that. And I'll just note Ms. Odanino and Planning Department's working on a grant application for North Washington, where it's, of course, planned for the whole corridor through the POA, but that Gresham intersection is in there. It is challenging when things are in the out year. So we'll keep a focus on that and see what we can do.
See, we have a few more hands up. Let's see, I don't recall who was first, but just in order of my screen, Mr. Puentes, go ahead.
Sorry, that was left over.
Okay, just kidding. Mrs. Comont, then you're next.
Hi, thanks. Just a couple of quick things. I just want to agree with Mr. Stevens' comments on having sort of an environmental section of the CIP. I think that's a great idea. I think climate change is a critical issue. The other, just looking at the potential spending categories, that I wondered if we might want to dedicate a little more to childcare. I think the amount was about $150,000. As somebody who's paid for childcare in the past, that just strikes me as low, particularly in comparison to some of the other amounts that are contemplated here. So just one comment on that. I also wanted to ask a question about the trail crossings, the WNOD trail crossings that are in the CIP snapshot. The snapshots seem to indicate that those are delayed until spring 2024. But then I think in the City Council, the ARPA staff report, it said that they will be, construction is expected to begin in the spring of 2022 with an anticipated completion in the fall of 2022. So can you just clarify which one it is?
Sure, and Mr. Stoddard, I don't know if you have immediate updates. I know Jeff's been working on that. Otherwise, I'll certainly get back and make sure we have the right fiscal year's reference.
Currently, the 2024 date is looking more likely. Currently, it looks like it's going to take us about 1 year to get from 100% plans, which we have in hand, to authorization to advertise for construction bids. So there's an entire year of delay in the procurement process. That's before we even put it out for the required bid period. And then, of course, we would be able to select the person for bid. Then we'd make sure that the weather lines up, get the person out there, and get it constructed as quickly as we could. So that's the reason for the delay in getting to construction.
That's really disappointing, just because the project is terrific. The widened trails are terrific, and that pinch point at the crossings is really difficult. Those bollards, they're really tough. And so I was really hopeful that I'd hear you say that the 2022 date is right. It's still too late, in my opinion. I wish we could have coordinated these two projects better. The trail was delayed even. I'm sure that there are much complicated issues, and I know you all are doing your best, but it's disappointing that we have this really great new trail and everybody's getting pinched at the crossings.
Concur.
Here, Ms. Weiss, I think you're next.
Yeah, it's sort of become a free-for-all at this point in time. I hope this is helpful. I know we kind of cut you off midway through the discussion, but I did want to jump to your the feedback on the equity and the environmental lens, particularly inspired by Mr. Stevens' comment. I think I would love to know how the equity lens is working in practice, and is it being used to identify overall gaps that need to be filled with things that don't exist in the CIP, for example, affordable housing, right? And related to that, I mean, I strongly support adding an environmental impact lens. And, I would propose that it be something fairly simple. Like, does this project help us achieve our climate commitment? Does this project reduce our risk from climate change? That's a climate lens. It's not an environment lens, but I think there's a strong argument that that's kind of the issue that we need to solve if we're going to solve all the others. So that's my feedback at this point.
Thank you.
Well, let's see. I think, Ms. Bester, it is getting late, and we probably should have scheduled this on a night where we had more time to kind of dig into it, and maybe we still have time at another meeting before the year's out, although pause is pretty heavily scheduled up the rest of the fall, but perhaps there's an opportunity where we could to dive deeper into some of the stuff. Just as we were talking, I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about you mentioned the city charter, and just as we were talking, I kind of Googled and pulled up the city charter, which is listed with the rest of state, it's on the state website for state code, and it seems to say that we do have the power to establish, maintain, and operate homes and facilities for the aged, the destitute, and that we're authorized to engage in or assist in the development or operation of housing for the elderly, handicapped, and for low or moderate income families and individuals. So the idea that the charter prohibits it, there seems to be a clause in there that says we can specifically do that, but I might be missing something. I'm not used to reading city charters. So maybe there's something else in there, but I'd be interested to hear more about where that prohibition in the charter, where is that? To cite that so we can understand where that comes from. It is hard to change a city charter, but it's not impossible, but it is difficult. Anyhow.
Not possible.
To change a city charter?
Not impossible. Not
impossible, right? I don't know if it takes the General Assembly has to do it, or I don't know what it takes, right?
Having to do it next General Assembly on one item to change board and commission participation, so you don't have to be a qualified voter. You just have to be a resident. So you can track that with council. We're talking about it again next Monday. Right. So it's doable.
Yeah, I'm just looking at
but I have legal stuff, so we can follow up with that for sure.
Yeah, it's section 2.05B in the city charter. Check it out. Maybe I'm missing something, but it appears to say that maybe we could do it. But anyhow, obviously we could spend another hour talking about this, but it is getting late and we've had a long night. But again, I know we'll be dealing with the CIP, formally, in the new year, but again, perhaps there's additional opportunities to continue to keep the dialogue going with you, because it is, it's helpful for us and for you too, I hope. And yes. The idea of having the earlier discussion, in theory, would mean that when we get into the meat of it in the new year, it goes smoother and we're all on the same page at that point, or as much as we can be sometimes. So anyhow, we'll keep in touch through Mr. Stoddard on some of those points, and we'll see where we can make some headway before the height of the CIP season. But again, thank you for your time and sticking it out and listening to that other discussion. I'm sure you had us on mute or something in the background, but you got to hear a lot about Broadview, Washington, which is also an important topic right now. So, okay, so unless any other commissioners have anything else to add on that, we'll wrap up that work session for now. The only other item we had a letter, which I don't really even want to get into it. It seemed to be a bit inaccurate, but We'll leave it at that. People can read the correspondence that came in. Otherwise, unless there's something else someone wants to bring up. Although, actually, wait, real quick, I know it's late. Paul, at the very beginning, we talked about getting back in person. I know you and I had chatted at a minimum of trying to get back in person for the December 15th advance in City Hall. But, if there's other progress, I know City Council's had several meetings now, hybrid, I guess, style, but with the council members in the chambers. So any further updates on that?
Yeah, so I actually may turn this over to Emily. So following our phone call, Chair, I chatted with Emily. She reached out to Celeste and Veronica in the clerk's office, and I think they had a good call about what that would take and what would be involved. Emily, we've got 8 minutes before the rules of procedure tell us to hang up. Do you want to do a brief recap?
Yeah, it's definitely doable. A lot of it's just coordinating internally with IT and Falls Church TV kind of running like a test during the workday to make sure we don't have any audio issues or anything like that at night. December is looking good. We also will have to go through security training, kind of similar to what you guys did in the past before the pandemic, where we had a walkthrough of like the escape route. And all of that with Joe Carter or Mary Gavin. I can keep you in the loop as to if we're doing late November or sometime in December. One thing that we wanted to clarify, though, is you guys do not have badges that staff have. Do you? I don't think you do.
No.
Okay, so we may need to coordinate getting you all badges, and that would be necessary for the security training.
Yeah, we need to get the badges because of the emergency. So thank you for bringing that up. That was why I raised my hand, Chair. We've changed the chambers and access for emergency egress, so I'll need to coordinate with Emily and Paul to get you all badges with how to get out the back through the emergency elevator if, heaven forbid, we need it.
Sure. And then just one other thing, I guess on the allowances for in-person meeting versus hybrid meeting versus remote meeting. So right now the commission is operating under the remote rules, and so all the commissioners can participate via computer. If we go back to what we're calling the hybrid meeting format, the commissioners would be obligated to be in person unless they're using the old virtual meeting participation rules, where I think you're limited to the number of times you can't be physically present and the reasons for which you can operate remotely. Staff and the public could still be on Teams, but the commissioners would have to be, I guess, physically anchored to the room.
Okay. Well, again, if people have particular concerns or questions about that, reach out to me or Paul in the interim, and we'll address it. But we're obviously going to go slow and ease back into things the same way council did. But as long as it's the general consensus is that it's a prudent thing to do to get back to some semblance of normal public meetings. I think it's wise that we begin to move in that direction. Cautiously, but using all the protocols and other procedures that are being kind of tested by council. And they're kind of working out the bugs with that, and assuming we can do that and meet all the legal requirements, I think that's the direction we should be heading. Slowly but surely. So, all right. Well, yeah, December would be a good way to kind of test it too, if we did it with the advance or whatever we did. And then have a couple weeks to see how it went and adjust. So I think that's a wise way to approach it. So okay, well. I think that is about it. And as Paul correctly noted, the 10:30, witching hour is approaching for us. So with that, I guess I will call tonight's meeting adjourned. We'll see everybody in a couple weeks.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Stay safe. Thank you.
Bye.